Everything accepted as historical fact begins collapsing right here. Impossible disappearances, forbidden relics, unexplained messages, and haunting incidents refuse every logical explanation. Each mystery pulls reality further apart, exposing unsettling fragments nobody expected to survive. Stay until the final chapter, because certainty will never feel the same afterward. The stone walls of the Bastille once absorbed countless whispers that never reached the streets of Paris. Behind thick iron doors, where torchlight flickered against damp masonry and every footstep echoed through narrow corridors, one prisoner lived in almost complete silence. His face was hidden behind a mask whenever others might see him, his movements carefully controlled, and his identity guarded with extraordinary determination. Long after the fortress itself disappeared, the mystery surrounding this anonymous captive has endured, becoming one of history's most enduring enigmas. The figure now remembered as the man in the iron mask was a real prisoner, although many historians believe the famous mask described in popular culture was likely made of black velvet rather than solid iron. The image of an iron mask owes much to later writers, who transformed a historical puzzle into an unforgettable legend. Yet, even without the dramatic metal covering, the documented facts remain remarkable enough. The prisoner first appeared under the watch of Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars, a trusted royal jailer who transferred him between several prisons during the late 17th century. Wherever Saint-Mars was appointed, the mysterious captive followed. He was held at Pignerol, later at the fortress on Sainte Marguerite Island, and eventually within the Bastille itself. Such repeated transfers suggest that someone considered him exceptionally important, or exceptionally dangerous. Official records reveal surprisingly little. The prisoner died in November 1703 and was buried under a different name, often recorded as Marchioli or a similar variation. Whether this was an intentional disguise, a clerical mistake, or another layer of secrecy remains uncertain. Even in death, his true identity seemed carefully concealed. Why would a government go to such lengths to hide a single man's name? Was he protecting a political secret, or was the monarchy protecting itself? One widely accepted theory proposes that the prisoner was Eustache Dogger, a servant arrested in 1669 under mysterious circumstances. Surviving correspondence between government officials discusses Dogger with unusual caution, instructing jailers to ensure that he never spoke freely with anyone. Some historians believe he possessed sensitive knowledge involving influential members of the royal court. If that were true, lifelong imprisonment might have seemed preferable to public scandal. Others have suggested that the captive was Count Ercole Antonio Mattioli, an Italian diplomat accused of betraying secret negotiations involving the French crown. His disappearance aligns with certain historical events, and similarities between his surname and the recorded burial name have fueled decades of debate. Yet, several details refuse to fit neatly, leaving many researchers unconvinced. More imaginative theories emerged over the centuries. Some writers propose that the prisoner was an illegitimate brother of King Louis XIV, hidden away to prevent disputes over succession. Others imagined he was the king's identical twin, secretly imprisoned because two heirs to the throne could threaten the stability of the monarchy. These ideas gained enormous popularity through novels and dramatic retellings, even though surviving historical evidence offers little direct support. Still more speculative interpretations point toward hidden societies, secret diplomatic missions, or confidential documents whose contents have never been fully understood. Could the prisoner have witnessed conversations that altered European politics? Did he possess knowledge considered too dangerous for public record? Or has history simply lost the ordinary details of an extraordinary imprisonment, allowing imagination to fill the empty spaces? The surviving documents are incomplete. Some records disappeared, Others contradict one another, and many were written by observers who knew only fragments of the story. Every newly examined letter seems to answer one question while quietly creating another. Historians continue comparing archives, studying official correspondence, and re-examining long-overlooked evidence, hoping that one overlooked detail may finally connect the scattered pieces. For now, the silent prisoner remains suspended between documented history and enduring legend. His cell is empty, the mask has long since disappeared, and the voices of those who knew the truth have faded into time. Yet, the question remains remarkably alive. Was the greatest secret hidden by the French crown the identity of one man, or the reason his name could never be spoken? While some mysteries are locked behind prison walls and hidden identities, others are scattered across windswept shores, swallowed by shifting tides, and concealed beneath centuries of sand. Few legends have inspired more determined searches than the supposed lost fortune of Captain William Kidd, a treasure that has tempted explorers, historians, and fortune hunters for more than 300 years. Along the rugged coastline of Oak Island, the quiet beaches of Long Island, and the remote islands of the Caribbean, the sea never truly rests. Waves erase footprints almost as quickly as they appear, carrying whispers of forgotten voyages with every incoming tide. It is easy to understand why so many believe that somewhere beneath these shorelines, hidden beneath layers of earth and rock, lies a fortune that has never been recovered. Captain William Kidd was not born a pirate. During the late 17th century, he sailed as a respected privateer, authorized by the English crown to capture hostile vessels operating against English interests. Such commissions were common at the time, allowing governments to wage unofficial naval warfare while avoiding direct responsibility. Everything changed after Kidd captured the Quedagh merchant in 1698. The richly laden vessel carried valuable cargo, but questions quickly arose over whether its seizure had been legal. Political pressure mounted, public opinion shifted, and Kidd found himself transformed from celebrated privateer into accused pirate. Returning to England to defend himself, he was arrested, tried, and executed in 1701. Before his death, however, another story had already begun to spread. Authorities recovered a relatively small cache of treasure that Kidd had buried on Gardiner's Island, off the coast of present-day New York. The discovery confirmed something important. Kidd had indeed hidden valuables before his capture. If one cache existed, could there have been others? That single verified burial became the foundation for centuries of speculation. Old maps, weathered journals, and anonymous letters have all been presented as clues pointing toward additional hiding places. Some suggest isolated coves along Nova Scotia. Others point toward islands in the Caribbean or secluded inlets along the eastern coast of North America. Yet, despite countless expeditions, no discovery has ever conclusively matched the legendary fortune described in popular imagination. Historians often argue that the treasure may never have been as vast as later stories claimed. Records indicate that much of Kidd's wealth was carefully documented, confiscated, or divided through legal proceedings. In this view, the enduring legend grew larger with each retelling, expanding far beyond the historical evidence. Others remain unconvinced. Some researchers note that gaps still exist within surviving financial records. Cargo inventories from the era are incomplete, witness testimonies occasionally conflict, and several reported sightings of buried chests emerged decades after Kidd's execution. While none has been verified, each has added another layer to an already complex puzzle. Even more speculative theories venture further. According to some traditions, Kidd entrusted portions of his fortune to loyal associates before his arrest, creating a network of hidden caches intended to remain untouched unless circumstances allowed his return. Others believe coded references survive within old maritime charts, disguised as ordinary navigational markings, understandable only to experienced sailors of the period. Whether these ideas contain genuine clues or simply reflect generations of hopeful interpretation remains impossible to determine. Today, the tide continues its patient work, reshaping coastlines that may, or may not, still conceal secrets from another age. Every storm uncovers forgotten fragments while burying others even deeper. Somewhere between documented history and enduring folklore, Captain Kidd's missing fortune remains one of the sea's most persistent riddles, waiting for the moment when another buried piece of the story might finally come to light. Just as the search for Captain William Kidd's hidden fortune reminds us that history often leaves behind unanswered questions, some mysteries are not buried beneath sand or concealed inside forgotten chests. Instead, they are written in ashes. Few events have transformed a city as completely, or inspired as much lasting debate, as the Great Fire of London. The narrow streets of 17th-century London were crowded with timber-framed houses that leaned toward one another across winding lanes. Wooden balconies nearly touched overhead, while workshops stored barrels of oil, tar, coal, and other flammable materials beside homes and marketplaces. In the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, the city was quiet. Then, somewhere along Pudding Lane, a small flame began to grow. According to the most widely accepted historical account, the fire started inside the bakery of Thomas Fariner, a baker to King Charles II. A neglected ember from an oven is believed to have ignited nearby fuel. Strong easterly winds soon carried burning debris from rooftop to rooftop, while months of unusually dry weather had left much of the city dangerously vulnerable. Before long, a single fire had become an unstoppable inferno. These facts are supported by contemporary accounts and official investigations. Yet, even among those who witnessed the disaster firsthand, certainty proved difficult to maintain. Over the next 4 days, the fire consumed roughly 13,000 houses, dozens of parish churches, public buildings, warehouses, and the medieval St. Paul's Cathedral. Tens of thousands of residents fled with whatever possessions they could carry, watching familiar neighborhoods disappear behind towering walls of smoke and flame. The scale of the destruction raised an unsettling question almost immediately. Could one accidental fire truly have spread so quickly and so completely? For many Londoners living through the catastrophe, the answer seemed difficult to accept. Rumors spread faster than reliable information. Some claimed they had seen strangers deliberately throwing fireballs into buildings. Others insisted that coordinated groups were setting blazes in several locations at once. Fear, confusion, and exhaustion made it nearly impossible to separate observation from speculation. England was already experiencing deep political and religious tensions. The country had recently endured civil war, plague, and ongoing conflict with foreign powers. As panic intensified, suspicion naturally turned toward outsiders. Foreign merchants, immigrants, and religious minorities were accused by frightened crowds, often without evidence. Several innocent people faced violence based solely on rumor. One of the most tragic examples involved a French watchmaker named Robert Huber. He confessed to helping start the fire, despite overwhelming evidence that he had not even arrived in London until after the blaze had already begun. Modern historians generally regard his confession as false, possibly influenced by confusion, coercion, or mental instability. Nevertheless, he was convicted and executed, illustrating how fear can sometimes shape history as powerfully as facts themselves. Official investigations ultimately concluded that the fire had been accidental. The combination of wooden construction, narrow streets, strong winds, limited firefighting equipment, and delayed responses created conditions in which even a small spark could unleash extraordinary destruction. Even so, not every question disappeared. Some researchers have pointed to inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts describing separate outbreaks during the height of the disaster. Others note that records from the period are incomplete, leaving room for continued debate about exactly how the flames advanced through different districts. Were these simply isolated embers carried by powerful winds, or did the chaos of the moment create the illusion of multiple origins? More speculative theories suggest that the fire may have provided unexpected advantages to certain political or economic interests. London was rebuilt with wider streets, improved building regulations, and increased use of brick and stone. While no credible evidence demonstrates that anyone deliberately planned such destruction to achieve these changes, the coincidence has encouraged discussion among later writers. Did opportunity emerge only after the disaster, or have later generations read too much into the city's remarkable transformation? As the smoke of London's great disaster slowly cleared, another mystery emerged on the opposite side of the Atlantic, one where fear spread not through fire, but through words. In Salem village, suspicion traveled from neighbor to neighbor, transforming ordinary lives into one of history's most unsettling episodes. Even today, the deeper forces behind those events remain difficult to fully explain. The old meeting house stood at the heart of Salem village, surrounded by rough wooden homes, narrow paths, and fields stretching toward dense forests. During the harsh winter of 1692, the settlement appeared peaceful from a distance. Yet, beneath its quiet routine, disagreements over religion, property, and authority had been simmering for years, creating invisible divisions that few outsiders could see. The Salem witch trials began after several young girls displayed disturbing and unexplained behavior. Their sudden fits, fearful outbursts, and unusual movements baffled local ministers and physicians. Unable to identify a physical cause, many concluded that supernatural forces were responsible. In a deeply religious Puritan community, such fears carried enormous weight. As accusations multiplied, the crisis expanded rapidly. More than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft. 19 were executed by hanging. One man was pressed to death after refusing to enter a plea, and others died while imprisoned. The surviving court records document these events in remarkable detail, yet they leave many questions unanswered. Modern historians generally agree that no single explanation accounts for what happened. Psychological stress, social pressure, religious belief, and fear all appear to have influenced the unfolding tragedy. But another possibility has attracted increasing attention over the years. Could political and economic rivalries have quietly shaped the accusations? Salem village was already divided long before the trials began. Families argued over land ownership, church leadership, taxation, and local government. Some historians have observed that several of the accused belonged to families involved in long-standing disputes with influential neighbors. While this pattern does not prove a coordinated campaign, it suggests that existing conflicts may have influenced whom suspicion ultimately targeted. The role of Reverend Samuel Parris adds another layer to the mystery. His leadership had become increasingly controversial, dividing the community into supporters and critics. Surviving documents reveal disagreements over his salary, authority, and influence. In such an atmosphere, personal grievances could easily become intertwined with genuine fear. The legal process itself also contributed to the uncertainty. Judges accepted spectral evidence, claims that an accused person's spirit had appeared in dreams or visions. Because such testimony could not be independently verified, the boundary between belief and evidence became increasingly blurred. Once accusations gained momentum, defending oneself became extraordinarily difficult. More speculative theories extend beyond local disputes. Some researchers have wondered whether colonial officials benefited from the unrest by strengthening political authority, during a period of uncertainty. Others suggest that broader social anxieties, including frontier conflicts and economic hardship, created conditions in which suspicion flourished. Direct evidence for these ideas remains limited, yet they continue to invite discussion because gaps persist within the historical record. When the trials finally ended, many participants later expressed regret, and colonial leaders acknowledged serious errors in judgment. Yet the complete story remains elusive. Fear undoubtedly played a central role, but whether hidden political motives quietly influenced the course of events is a question that continues to linger. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not why the accusations began, but how many unseen ambitions were concealed behind them, waiting to disappear into history without leaving a clear trace. As the echoes of Salem's courtroom accusations gradually faded, another mystery from the early modern world invites a similar question. How much of history is shaped by the events we can clearly document, and how much remains concealed behind incomplete records and silent witnesses? Few conspiracies illustrate that uncertainty more vividly than the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. Deep beneath the Palace of Westminster, stone corridors stretch through cool, dimly lit vaults that have stood for centuries. The thick walls seem almost untouched by time, preserving the memory of one of England's most infamous conspiracies. It was here, within a rented cellar beneath the House of Lords, that dozens of barrels filled with gunpowder were discovered before dawn on November 5, 1605. Their discovery prevented what could have become one of the most devastating political attacks in English history. The official account is well established. A group of English Catholics, frustrated by continued religious persecution under King James I, planned to destroy the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament. The explosion was intended to kill the king, members of Parliament, senior judges, and leading nobles in a single moment, creating an opportunity to replace the existing government with one more favorable to Catholic interests. The man found guarding the explosives was Guy Fawkes, an experienced soldier who had served in continental Europe. His arrest transformed him into the most recognizable figure associated with the conspiracy. Yet surviving documents make one point remarkably clear. Fawkes was not the architect of the plan. The conspiracy itself was organized by Robert Catesby, a charismatic gentleman who believed that peaceful efforts to improve the position of English Catholics had failed. Over time, he recruited a small circle of trusted associates, each sworn to secrecy. Their preparations lasted many months, involving rented properties, hidden supplies, coded communication, and careful planning. Even so, historians continue to ask whether the known conspirators were truly the only people involved. The anonymous letter sent to Lord Monteagle remains one of the greatest puzzles surrounding the plot. Delivered just days before Parliament was scheduled to meet, it warned him to avoid attending the ceremony because a terrible blow was about to fall. The letter prompted authorities to search the cellar, ultimately leading to the discovery of the gunpowder. Who wrote the warning? One widely accepted theory suggests that it came from Francis Tresham, one of the conspirators whose family connections included Lord Monteagle. According to this interpretation, Tresham may have hoped to save a relative without exposing the entire conspiracy. Yet no definitive proof confirms his authorship, and the question remains unresolved. Other historians have proposed that government officials may have learned of the conspiracy through informants long before the famous letter appeared. England's intelligence network under Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, was already extensive and highly effective. Agents monitored correspondence, tracked suspected dissidents, and gathered information throughout the kingdom. Could the government have uncovered the plot earlier than official accounts suggest? More speculative interpretations go further still. Some writers have argued that the authorities may have allowed portions of the conspiracy to continue under surveillance, intervening only when success was certain. In this view, exposing the plot at precisely the right moment would strengthen public support for the crown while justifying harsher measures against suspected enemies. No surviving evidence conclusively supports this idea, and many historians consider it unlikely. Nevertheless, the theory persists because several official records remain incomplete or open to interpretation. Questions also surround the financing of the conspiracy. Maintaining secret meeting places, acquiring large quantities of gunpowder, and supporting participants over many months required considerable resources. Were these expenses covered entirely by the known conspirators, or did sympathetic supporters contribute from the shadows without ever appearing in surviving documents? After the plot failed, several conspirators were killed while resisting capture, while others were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Their confessions provide valuable historical evidence, yet many were obtained under extreme pressure, leaving historians to carefully weigh every statement against independent records. If the gunpowder plot reminds us that some conspiracies leave behind unanswered questions despite abundant records, the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke presents the opposite challenge. Here, the silence itself has become the evidence. Instead of confessions, letters, and court documents, history offers only fragments, inviting each generation to search for what was never fully explained. Along the windswept shores of Roanoke Island, the Atlantic Ocean rolls steadily against stretches of marsh, forest, and shifting sand. Salt air drifts through towering pines, while hidden inlets disappear beneath changing tides. It is a landscape that feels both inviting and isolating, a place where survival once depended upon cooperation with the unfamiliar world surrounding it. More than 4 centuries later, the quiet coastline still seems to guard a secret. In 1587, a group of approximately 115 English settlers established a colony on Roanoke Island under the leadership of Governor John White. Among them were families, craftsmen, and children seeking to build England's first permanent settlement in North America. White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, born shortly after the colony's arrival, became the first English child known to have been born in the region. From the beginning, however, the settlement faced uncertainty. Supplies were limited, relationships with neighboring indigenous communities were complex, and the colony depended upon regular support from England. Hoping to secure additional provisions, John White reluctantly sailed back across the Atlantic only weeks after the settlement was established. His return was delayed far longer than anyone expected. England's conflict with the Spanish Armada redirected ships and resources, preventing White from returning until 1590. When he finally stepped ashore once again on Roanoke Island, the settlement had disappeared. The houses had been dismantled rather than destroyed. There were no signs of battle, no scattered belongings suggesting panic, and no graves indicating a violent end. Instead, White found only one unmistakable clue. Carved into a wooden post was the word Croatoan. Nearby, the shortened word CRO had been carved into a tree. Before leaving, White had arranged a simple agreement with the colonists. If they relocated voluntarily, they would carve their destination into a visible surface. If they departed under immediate danger, they would add the image of a Maltese cross beside the message. No cross was found. To many historians, this remains the strongest evidence that the settlers left deliberately rather than by force. Croatoan referred to a nearby island, now known as Hatteras Island, where an indigenous community maintained friendly relations with portions of the English colony. According to the most widely accepted interpretation, at least some of the settlers likely joined this community after recognizing that survival alone had become impossible. Archaeological discoveries have provided cautious support for this possibility. European artifacts dating to the appropriate period have been uncovered on Hatteras Island, including tools, ceramics, and other objects that may indicate prolonged contact between English settlers and indigenous communities. While these discoveries cannot conclusively identify the missing colonists, they suggest that cultural interaction almost certainly occurred. Other researchers have explored different possibilities. Some propose that the settlers attempted to relocate farther inland, establishing a new community along the Albemarle Sound or near the Chowan River. Excavations at several inland sites have uncovered fragments of English pottery and metalwork from the late 16th century, though interpreting these discoveries remains challenging. Do they represent a relocated colony, isolated trade, or unrelated settlements established years later? More speculative theories suggest a far darker fate. According to some traditions, the settlers were attacked by hostile groups after whites' departure. Others imagine famine, disease, or severe storms gradually reducing the colony until no organized settlement remained. These possibilities cannot be entirely dismissed, yet neither have they been confirmed by surviving evidence. There are even persistent stories that descendants of the colonists lived for generations among indigenous communities, preserving fragments of English language and customs that slowly blended with local traditions. Early colonial accounts occasionally mention individuals with European features or unfamiliar family histories. Whether these reports reflect genuine descendants of Roanoke or misunderstandings shaped by rumor remains uncertain. The greatest obstacle facing historians is the absence of definitive records. No eyewitness account describes the colony's final days. No official report explains where every settler went. Centuries of coastal erosion have altered the landscape itself, potentially burying or washing away valuable archaeological evidence before it could ever be examined. Today, Roanoke Island appears peaceful, its forests and waterways giving little hint of the uncertainty they have inspired for more than 400 years. The carved word Croatoan remains one of history's most haunting clues, not because it answers the mystery, but because it seems to point toward an explanation that remains just beyond reach. Somewhere beneath shifting soil, hidden among forgotten records, or preserved within stories yet to be fully understood, the final fate of the lost colony may still be waiting to emerge from silence. Like the mystery of Roanoke, where a single carved word became the only surviving clue, some of history's greatest political mysteries also hinge upon a handful of moments that change the course of nations. In these cases, the central question is not what happened, but whether the official explanation tells the entire story. Such is the enduring mystery surrounding the assassination of King Henry IV of France. The narrow streets of early 17th century Paris were alive with merchants, horse-drawn carriages, and crowded marketplaces. Tall buildings leaned over uneven roads, leaving little room for passing traffic. On the afternoon of May 14, 1610, the king's royal carriage slowed to a stop after becoming trapped by congestion near the Rue de la Ferronnerie. What appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary delay would soon become one of the defining moments in French history. From the crowd emerged François Ravaillac, a deeply religious man from Angoulême. Carrying a knife concealed beneath his clothing, he climbed onto the stationary carriage and stabbed King Henry IV repeatedly. The king died almost immediately. Panic swept through the streets as guards seized the attacker before he could escape. The historical record leaves little doubt about the identity of the assassin. Ravaillac confessed to the killing during repeated interrogations and remained consistent in claiming that he had acted alone. He believed Henry IV intended to wage war against Catholic powers in Europe and viewed the king's policies as a threat to the Catholic faith. Convicted of regicide, Ravaillac was executed shortly afterward, in one of the most severe public punishments of the era. On the surface, the case appears remarkably straightforward. Yet, historians have long questioned whether such a consequential act could truly have been carried out without assistance, encouragement, or prior knowledge from others. Henry IV had transformed France after decades of devastating religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. His conversion to Catholicism, combined with the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granted significant protections to many Protestants while seeking to stabilize the kingdom. Although these measures brought relative peace, they also created determined enemies on multiple sides. Religious extremists considered him a traitor, while political rivals viewed his growing authority with increasing concern. In such an atmosphere, conspiracy theories emerged almost immediately after his death. Some contemporaries suspected that Catholic extremists may have encouraged Ravaillac behind the scenes. Others pointed toward influential noble families who opposed the king's policies and may have benefited from his sudden death. Despite extensive investigations, however, authorities uncovered no definitive evidence linking Ravaillac to an organized network. Attention has also focused on the assassins' movements during the weeks leading up to the attack. Historical records show that Ravaillac traveled repeatedly to Paris while attempting to gain access to the king. He spoke openly about religious visions and sought audiences with royal officials, yet few appear to have regarded him as a serious threat. Was this simply the behavior of an isolated fanatic, or did unnoticed contacts help him navigate the capital and monitor the king's movements? Another question concerns the remarkable opportunity itself. Royal security during the period was far less sophisticated than modern standards, and Henry IV was known for maintaining relatively direct contact with his subjects. Even so, some researchers have wondered whether the carriage's unexpected delay created an opportunity too convenient to ignore. Most historians attribute the stop entirely to the crowded streets of Paris, yet speculation has persisted over whether chance alone determined the timing. More speculative interpretations extend beyond France itself. Henry IV had been preparing for military action that could have altered the balance of power across Europe. Some later writers have proposed that foreign courts or powerful political interests quietly welcomed his removal, or perhaps even encouraged it indirectly. No convincing documentary evidence has confirmed these claims, but incomplete diplomatic correspondence from the period has left enough uncertainty to keep such discussions alive. The official investigation relied heavily on Ravaillac's own testimony. Despite enduring prolonged interrogation, he never identified accomplices or altered his central claim that he had acted independently. Some historians consider this consistency persuasive evidence that the conspiracy ended with one man. Others caution that silence alone cannot eliminate every possibility, particularly when many conversations, private meetings, and political relationships left no permanent record. Today, the streets of Paris bear little resemblance to those of 1610, yet the questions surrounding that fatal afternoon continue to echo through historical research. One man unquestionably carried out the attack, and the broad outline of events is well documented. But whether François Ravaillac was truly guided only by his own convictions, or whether unseen influences quietly shaped the path that led him to the king's carriage, remains a mystery that history has never answered with complete certainty. As the questions surrounding the assassination of Henry IV remind us, history often preserves the final moments of remarkable individuals while leaving the true causes open to debate. Sometimes, the mystery centers not on a public act of violence, but on a quiet death far from home, one that, centuries later, continues to invite careful investigation. Such is the case of the philosopher René Descartes. In the cold winter mornings of Stockholm, pale light filters through frost-covered windows as icy air drifts across the city's waterways. During the winter of 1650, The Swedish capital was a place of long nights and freezing temperatures, far removed from the milder climate of France where René Descartes had spent most of his life. The philosopher, known for his methodical pursuit of reason and certainty, found himself living in unfamiliar surroundings under demanding circumstances. Descartes had traveled to Sweden at the invitation of Queen Christina, an intellectually curious ruler eager to study philosophy. The queen preferred to hold lessons before sunrise, requiring the aging scholar to leave his warm quarters during the coldest hours of the day. According to the traditional historical account, this abrupt change in routine, combined with the harsh Scandinavian winter, weakened his health. Within only a few months of arriving, Descartes became seriously ill. Official reports from the time describe symptoms consistent with pneumonia. After several days of declining health, he died on February 11, 1650, at the age of 53. For generations, historians accepted this explanation with little controversy. Pneumonia was common during the 17th century, and medical treatment remained limited by the knowledge of the period. Yet, the story did not end there. Centuries later, researchers began to re-examine surviving correspondence, medical descriptions, and eyewitness accounts. Some noticed details that appeared difficult to reconcile with the conventional diagnosis. The reported progression of Descartes' illness seemed unusually rapid, and certain symptoms described in historical records have prompted renewed discussion among medical historians. One of the most widely discussed alternative theories emerged in the late 20th century. According to this interpretation, Descartes may not have died from natural illness at all. Instead, he may have been deliberately poisoned with arsenic. Supporters of this hypothesis point to historical accounts describing severe stomach pain, repeated vomiting, and a sudden deterioration that they argue could resemble acute arsenic poisoning. Some have suggested that a Catholic missionary, fearing the philosopher's growing influence at the Protestant Swedish court, might have viewed Descartes as a religious or intellectual threat. In this scenario, poison concealed within food, medicine, or sacramental wine has been proposed as a possible method. The theory has attracted attention because it attempts to explain several unusual aspects of the surviving evidence. However, direct proof has never been discovered. No contemporary document conclusively describes poisoning, and no physical evidence survives that would allow modern forensic testing. Many historians remain cautious. Medical experts have noted that pneumonia itself can produce a wide range of severe symptoms, particularly in an era without antibiotics. Infections frequently progressed quickly, especially during harsh winters, and historical medical records often lack the precision needed to distinguish between different illnesses. From this perspective, the traditional explanation remains entirely plausible. Other researchers suggest that several factors may have combined to weaken Descartes. The demanding schedule imposed by Queen Christina, exposure to freezing temperatures, physical exhaustion, and the emotional strain of adapting to a foreign court could all have reduced his resistance to disease. Rather than pointing toward conspiracy, these circumstances may simply illustrate the vulnerability of even the greatest thinkers. Still, certain questions continue to linger. Why do some descriptions of his final days differ from others? Were later accounts influenced by rumor, imperfect memory, or attempts to reshape the story for political or religious reasons? And if important letters or medical observations have been lost over the centuries, what details disappeared with them? Today, René Descartes is remembered as one of history's most influential philosophers, a man who sought certainty through careful reasoning and relentless doubt. Ironically, the circumstances of his own death remain surrounded by uncertainty. Whether he succumbed to a devastating illness brought on by Stockholm's unforgiving winter, or became the victim of a carefully concealed act of poisoning, the final chapter of his life continues to remind us that even the clearest historical narratives may still conceal unanswered questions waiting quietly beneath the surface. As the uncertain circumstances surrounding René Descartes' final days remind us, history often preserves official explanations while leaving quieter, more troubling possibilities beneath the surface. Sometimes, those mysteries are found not in royal courts or philosophical circles, but within settlements struggling simply to survive. Few episodes reveal the fragile boundary between documented history and hidden truth more vividly than Jamestown's starving time. The remains of the old fort stand beside the slow-moving James River, where morning mist drifts across the water before dissolving into the Virginia air. Beneath layers of soil lie fragments of broken pottery, rusted tools, and weathered timbers, the silent traces of England's first permanent settlement in North America. Today, the landscape appears peaceful, but during the winter of 1609 to 1610, it became the setting for one of colonial history's darkest chapters. Known simply as the Starving Time, those desperate months nearly ended the Jamestown colony altogether. Of roughly 300 settlers, only about 60 survived until relief ships finally arrived. Contemporary accounts describe relentless hunger, disease, freezing temperatures, and strained relations with surrounding indigenous communities, which limited opportunities to obtain food beyond the settlement's walls. Surviving letters and journals paint a grim picture. Colonists consumed horses, dogs, rats, snakes, leather, and even discarded scraps that would never normally have been considered food. George Percy, one of the colony's leaders, recorded scenes of profound desperation, suggesting that ordinary social boundaries had collapsed beneath the pressure of survival. Among the most disturbing claims preserved in these writings is the accusation that some settlers resorted to cannibalism. For generations, many historians questioned whether these reports reflected reality or whether they had been exaggerated to dramatize the colony's suffering. Early colonial narratives often mixed first-hand observation with rumor, making it difficult to separate witnessed events from stories repeated under extraordinary stress. Then, centuries later, archaeology introduced an unexpected piece of evidence. In 2012, researchers studying human remains discovered the skull and partial skeleton of a young girl, later nicknamed Jane. Careful forensic analysis revealed cut marks on her bones that were consistent with attempts to remove flesh and access the brain after death. The injuries showed no evidence of battle or torture while she was alive, leading researchers to conclude that her body had likely been dismembered after death during the height of the famine. To many historians, this discovery provided the strongest physical evidence yet that at least one documented account of survival cannibalism had been accurate. Yet another question soon emerged. If such events truly occurred, why do official colonial records appear so restrained in describing them? Some scholars argue that leaders of the Virginia Company had powerful reasons to protect the colony's reputation. Jamestown depended upon continued financial support from investors in England. Detailed reports emphasizing starvation, disorder, or cannibalism could have discouraged future investment and immigration. According to this interpretation, the most disturbing details may have been softened, omitted, or simply left out of official publications intended for influential audiences. Others suggest a less deliberate explanation. Many records from the settlement have been lost, damaged, or survive only in fragmentary form. What appears to be a cover-up today may instead reflect the ordinary disappearance of documents over 4 centuries. Personal journals vanished, letters never reached their destinations, and countless voices were never recorded at all. More speculative theories propose that the known evidence represents only a fraction of what truly occurred during that terrible winter. If one victim bears unmistakable signs of post-mortem butchery, were there others whose remains have yet to be discovered? Did survivors remain silent out of shame? Or did later generations quietly reshape the story into something more acceptable for public memory? The archaeological record continues to expand, but it remains incomplete. Each excavation uncovers new fragments while raising new uncertainties, reminding researchers that the ground beneath Jamestown still holds untold stories. Today, visitors walk through reconstructed sections of the settlement, where birds call across the river and gentle winds move through the surrounding trees. Little in the peaceful landscape hints at the suffering endured there more than 4 centuries ago. Yet, beneath the earth, and between the surviving lines of history, the starving time continues to ask an unsettling question. How much of humanity's darkest struggle for survival has been preserved, and how much may still remain hidden, waiting to be uncovered? As the story of Jamestown reminds us, some of history's deepest mysteries are preserved not only in buried remains, but also in lives cut unexpectedly short. Among the many figures connected to England's first permanent colony in North America, few have inspired as much fascination and as many unanswered questions as Pocahontas. Her final days remain clouded by uncertainty, leaving historians to examine scattered records in search of an explanation that has never been fully resolved. The quiet churchyard at St. George's Church in Gravesend, England, overlooks the River Thames, where ships have arrived and departed for centuries. Although the original church where Pocahontas was buried was later destroyed by fire and rebuilt, the grounds remain a place of reflection. Visitors stand before a memorial rather than a confirmed grave, contemplating the brief life of a woman whose story has often been transformed into legend, making the historical truth increasingly difficult to separate from later interpretation. Known to her own people as Matoaka, and sometimes by the private name Amonute, Pocahontas was the daughter of Wahunsenakau, the powerful leader of the Powhatan Confederacy. English records first mention her during the early years of the Jamestown settlement, though many of the best-known stories, particularly those involving Captain John Smith, remain the subject of considerable historical debate. Some historians believe Smith's famous rescue narrative reflected a misunderstanding of Powhatan ceremonial traditions, while others question whether the event occurred as later described. What is more firmly documented is that Pocahontas was captured by English settlers in 1613 during a period of conflict. While in captivity, she converted to Christianity, was baptized as Rebecca, and later married the English tobacco planter John Rolfe. Their marriage became a symbol of temporary peace between the English colony and the Powhatan Confederacy, a period sometimes referred to as the Peace of Pocahontas. In 1616, Pocahontas, Rolfe, and their young son traveled to England. The Virginia Company presented her to English society as evidence of the colony's success and of what it described as the possibilities of cultural and religious conversion. She met members of the royal court and attracted considerable attention wherever she appeared. Yet, only months later, as the family prepared to return to Virginia, everything changed. In March 1617, while their ship was anchored near Gravesend, Pocahontas became suddenly and seriously ill. She died shortly afterward, believed to have been around 21 years old. Contemporary accounts offer only brief descriptions of her condition, noting that her illness developed rapidly. No detailed medical report survives, leaving historians with little direct evidence. The traditional explanation is that she died from an infectious disease. Smallpox, pneumonia, tuberculosis, dysentery, or another respiratory or gastrointestinal illness have all been proposed. 17th century England was vulnerable to outbreaks of disease, and visitors from distant lands often possessed little immunity to unfamiliar infections. Under these circumstances, a sudden fatal illness would not have been unusual. Even so, uncertainty remains. Because surviving records are so limited, alternative possibilities have occasionally been explored. Some researchers have wondered whether the stress of travel, unfamiliar food, and exposure to crowded urban environments weakened her health before the final illness appeared. Others note that long sea voyages of the period often brought poor sanitation and harsh living conditions, creating opportunities for disease to spread quickly among passengers. More speculative theories have suggested that Pocahontas may have been deliberately poisoned. According to these interpretations, her political importance and symbolic value made her a significant figure whose death could have served hidden interests. However, no contemporary evidence directly supports such claims, and no surviving witness describes circumstances that clearly point toward foul play. These theories persist largely because the historical record leaves crucial questions unanswered, rather than because compelling proof has emerged. Another mystery concerns the accounts written by those closest to her. Few first-hand descriptions survive from her final days, and the existing reports are remarkably brief considering her prominence. Was this simply the result of ordinary record-keeping in the early 17th century, or were important details lost over time as letters disappeared and documents failed to survive? Today, the River Thames continues its quiet journey past Gravesend, much as it did on the day Pocahontas's final voyage came to an unexpected end. The woman remembered through countless stories remains both a historical figure and a symbol shaped by generations of retelling. Her life connected two very different worlds, but the circumstances of her death remain frustratingly uncertain. Whether illness alone claimed her life, or whether some forgotten detail has vanished into the silence of history, the final chapter of Pocahontas's story continues to invite careful reflection, and perhaps one day, a deeper understanding still waiting to be uncovered. As the mystery surrounding Pocahontas reminds us, history is often shaped as much by belief as by evidence. A rumor, repeated often enough, can alter lives, influence governments, and leave consequences that last for generations. Few examples demonstrate this more clearly than the Popish plot, a conspiracy that never truly existed, yet produced fear so convincing that it became one of the greatest political crises in 17th century England. The echo of footsteps drifts through the stone corridors of Westminster, where candlelight once illuminated chambers filled with anxious conversation. Beyond heavy oak doors, judges, ministers, and members of Parliament debated reports of an invisible threat said to be moving quietly through the kingdom. Every whispered accusation seemed to reveal another hidden enemy, while certainty became increasingly difficult to distinguish from suspicion. The story began in 1678, when Titus Oates, a former Anglican clergyman with a troubled reputation, claimed to have uncovered a vast Catholic conspiracy. According to his testimony, powerful figures were plotting to assassinate King Charles II, overthrow the government, and restore Catholic dominance in England. Oates described secret meetings, coded messages, foreign agents, and an organized network prepared to act at any moment. His allegations arrived during a period of profound religious and political tension. England had experienced decades of conflict between Protestant and Catholic factions, and public distrust remained widespread. Against this backdrop, Oates's extraordinary claims found a receptive audience. What might otherwise have seemed improbable suddenly appeared possible. Investigations began almost immediately. Several innocent people were arrested, prosecuted, and ultimately executed based largely upon testimony that was later shown to be unreliable. Parliament debated emergency measures, public fear intensified, and rumors spread through cities and villages with remarkable speed. The atmosphere became one in which accusation alone could permanently destroy a person's reputation. Over time, however, important inconsistencies began to emerge. Historians now agree that much of the alleged conspiracy was fabricated. Oates's statements contained contradictions, impossible timelines, and factual errors that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Eventually, his credibility collapsed, and after the accession of King James II, he was convicted of perjury. Yet one central question continues to attract historical interest. If the Popish plot was largely invented, was Titus Oates acting entirely on his own? The traditional explanation portrays him as an ambitious individual seeking influence, financial reward, and public recognition through an elaborate deception. His personal history, marked by failed careers and disciplinary problems, appears consistent with someone willing to exploit widespread fear for personal gain. Other historians suggest that the situation may have been more complicated. Political factions within Parliament were already deeply divided over the future succession to the English throne. Because Charles II had no legitimate heirs, attention increasingly focused on his brother James, Duke of York, who had openly converted to Catholicism. Many influential Protestants feared what his eventual accession might mean for the kingdom. Could the allegations have been encouraged because they supported existing political objectives? Some researchers argue that leading political figures may not have created the story, but recognized its usefulness once it began to spread. By amplifying fears of a Catholic conspiracy, they could strengthen arguments against James' succession and reshape public opinion during a period of intense constitutional debate. While surviving evidence does not conclusively demonstrate coordinated manipulation, correspondence from the period reveals that political leaders quickly incorporated the alleged plot into wider struggles over power and governance. More speculative theories extend even further. Some writers have wondered whether intelligence networks, foreign interests, or influential members of the royal court quietly circulated information that reinforced Oates's accusations without directly inventing them. Others believe the conspiracy expanded largely through ordinary human psychology, as frightened witnesses unintentionally reinforced one another's suspicions until rumor acquired the appearance of fact. The surviving records support elements of each interpretation while leaving significant gaps. Many private conversations were never documented, numerous letters have disappeared, and the motivations of key participants remain open to interpretation. Historians continue comparing court records, parliamentary debates, and personal correspondence, searching for overlooked details that might clarify how a fabricated conspiracy gained such extraordinary influence. Today, the Popish plot stands as a powerful reminder that history is not shaped solely by events that actually occurred, but also by those that people believed were about to happen. A story built upon fear altered laws, ended lives, and changed the course of English politics before finally collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Even now, one question quietly lingers beneath the surviving documents. Was Titus Oates merely an isolated deceiver, or did unseen hands help transform one man's fiction into a national crisis whose full origins remain hidden from history? As the Popish plot demonstrates, political upheaval rarely ends when the public crisis fades. Long after the accusations, trials, and speeches have passed into history, individuals remain who must live with the consequences. Some disappear into exile, others into legend, leaving behind mysteries that grow only more compelling with time. Such is the story of the English Regicides who fled after the execution of King Charles I. Deep within old New England forests, narrow paths wind between towering oaks and weathered stone foundations, where abandoned settlements have gradually been reclaimed by nature. Elsewhere, across quiet European ports and remote countryside estates, forgotten houses once offered temporary refuge to men whose names had become synonymous with treason. Many of those buildings still stand today, silent witnesses to lives spent looking over a shoulder, never certain who might arrive at the door next. On January 30th, 1649, King Charles I was publicly executed outside the banqueting house in London. It was an event without precedent in English history. Following a civil war that had divided the kingdom, A specially appointed High Court of Justice condemned the king for treason against his own people. 59 commissioners signed the death warrant, forever linking themselves to one of Britain's most controversial political decisions. For a brief period, those signatures represented victory. But history changed course once again. In 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, the executed king's son. Almost immediately, efforts began to identify, arrest, and punish everyone connected to his father's execution. Some regicides were captured and subjected to public executions. Others had already died, though even death offered little protection. In several extraordinary cases, the bodies of deceased regicides were exhumed and symbolically executed, reflecting the Crown's determination to erase what it viewed as an act of unforgivable rebellion. Yet not everyone was found. Several commissioners escaped England before the Restoration, seeking safety in the American colonies or elsewhere across Europe. Among the most famous were Edward Whalley and William Gough, both of whom arrived in New England, where sympathetic Puritan communities offered protection despite growing pressure from English authorities. For years, reports placed the fugitives in different settlements, hidden within private homes, secluded caves, and isolated rural communities. One location in present-day Connecticut became especially associated with their story. Known today as Judge's Cave, the rocky shelter has long been linked to local traditions, claiming that the regicides concealed themselves there while royal agents searched the surrounding countryside. How much of this account reflects documented history, and how much belongs to later folklore? Surviving letters confirm that Whalley and Gough received assistance from trusted supporters and frequently changed locations to avoid discovery. However, many details of their movements remain uncertain. The historical record grows increasingly sparse during their later years, leaving historians to reconstruct their lives from scattered correspondence, financial records, and occasional eyewitness references. The greatest mystery surrounds their final fate. Most researchers believe both men died quietly in hiding during the late 17th century, but no definitive burial sites have ever been confirmed. Some accounts suggest they remained under assumed identities until the end of their lives. Others indicate they lived in relative isolation, protected by local communities unwilling to surrender them to the English crown. More speculative traditions tell a different story. According to regional folklore, the regicides continued moving secretly between safe houses long after officials believed them to be gone. Some legends claim they adopted entirely new identities and blended into colonial society so successfully that their descendants never knew their true origins. Others suggest coded messages and hidden correspondence allowed supporters to coordinate their movements across great distances, leaving behind a network that has never been fully documented. Even the royal search was imperfect. Communication between England and the American colonies required months, making coordinated investigations slow and often ineffective. By the time officials received reliable information, the fugitives may already have vanished once more into another settlement, another household, or another carefully guarded refuge. Today, weathered caves, quay. There is little direct evidence supporting these more elaborate claims, yet they persist because important pieces of the historical record remain missing. Personal diaries disappeared, private letters were destroyed, and many conversations were never committed to paper. In an age when secrecy meant survival, silence itself became a form of protection. Even the royal search was imperfect. Communication between England and the American colonies required months, making coordinated investigations slow and often ineffective. By the time officials received reliable information, the fugitives may already have vanished once more into another settlement, another household, or another carefully guarded refuge. Today, weathered caves, quiet churchyards, and forgotten colonial homes continue to be associated with the men who once signed a king's death warrant and then disappeared into history. Their names remain preserved in official records, but the final chapters of their lives are far less certain. Did they spend their remaining years in peaceful obscurity, or do undiscovered documents still lie hidden in forgotten archives, waiting to reveal how England's most wanted fugitives truly escaped the reach of history? As the story of the fugitive regicides illustrates, the English Civil War did not truly end when the fighting stopped. Its consequences lingered for decades, shaping lives, inspiring revenge, and leaving behind questions that historians still debate. Among those unresolved mysteries is the death of the man who stood at the very center of that turbulent era, Oliver Cromwell. Within the ancient walls of Whitehall Palace, long corridors once echoed with the footsteps of soldiers, ministers, and royal servants. Candlelight flickered against carved wooden panels as messengers hurried between chambers carrying news from across the kingdom. It was here, surrounded by the weight of political responsibility and years of conflict, that Oliver Cromwell spent his final days during the late summer of 1658. By then, Cromwell had become one of the most powerful and controversial figures in British history. After the execution of King Charles I, he emerged as Lord Protector, ruling England, Scotland, and Ireland during the Commonwealth. Admired by supporters as a defender of Parliament and condemned by critics as a military ruler, he governed a nation still recovering from years of civil war and deep political division. On September 3, 1658, Cromwell died at Whitehall Palace. The official explanation has long appeared straightforward. Contemporary physicians believed he suffered from a combination of recurring malaria, then commonly called ague, and a severe urinary or kidney infection, possibly complicated by septicemia. Surviving descriptions mention periods of fever, exhaustion, and declining health during the weeks before his death. Considering the limitations of 17th century medicine, many historians regard these illnesses as entirely sufficient to explain his final decline. Yet, as with many influential figures whose deaths altered the course of history, alternative theories soon emerged. Cromwell had accumulated countless enemies throughout Britain and Europe. Royalists blamed him for the execution of Charles I and the abolition of the monarchy. Some former allies had become disillusioned with his leadership, while others opposed his growing political authority. In such a deeply divided nation, it is perhaps unsurprising that rumors began circulating almost immediately after his death. One enduring theory suggests that Cromwell may have been poisoned. Supporters of this idea point to the political advantages that his death created for various factions eager to reshape England's future. According to later accounts, poison might have been administered gradually through food, drink, or medicine, disguising its effects beneath the symptoms that resembled natural illness. Certain chronic poisons known during the 17th century could produce prolonged weakness, fever, and digestive distress, making definitive diagnosis extremely difficult with the medical knowledge available at the time. However, no contemporary investigation uncovered convincing evidence of foul play. The physicians attending Cromwell recorded symptoms that align reasonably well with infectious disease, and no surviving witness described circumstances that clearly indicate poisoning. Modern medical historians generally consider the natural explanation more persuasive, noting that malaria could recur for years after an initial infection, and often weakened patients enough to make secondary infections particularly dangerous. Still, some uncertainties remain. Descriptions of Cromwell's final illness vary slightly between surviving sources. Certain reports emphasize intermittent fevers, while others focus more heavily on complications affecting his kidneys or urinary system. Such inconsistencies are not unusual in 17th century medical records, yet they leave room for continued interpretation. Were observers simply recording different stages of the same illness, or did later writers reshape the story according to political loyalties? More speculative interpretations extend beyond individual assassination theories. Some researchers have wondered whether physicians themselves fully understood the illnesses they were treating. Medical practice during the period relied heavily on bloodletting, herbal remedies, and theories of bodily balance that modern science has largely abandoned. Could treatments intended to save Cromwell have unintentionally hastened his decline? Or did multiple illnesses strike simultaneously, creating symptoms that no single diagnosis can adequately explain? The events following his death only deepened the sense of historical irony. Less than 3 years later, after the restoration of Charles II, Cromwell's body was exhumed from Westminster Abbey. In a symbolic act of royal justice, his remains were subjected to a posthumous execution, his body hanged in chains, and his severed head displayed publicly for years before passing through several private collections over the following centuries. Today, Whitehall Palace has largely disappeared, but the questions surrounding Cromwell's final days remain remarkably alive. The official record points toward natural illness, supported by many historians and medical researchers. Yet, the political climate surrounding his death, the extraordinary consequences that followed, and the inevitable gaps within 17th century documentation continue to invite reflection. Whether Oliver Cromwell died from disease alone, or whether hidden hands quietly influenced the final chapter of his life, remains a mystery that history has never entirely laid to rest. As the mystery surrounding Oliver Cromwell's death reminds us, the most significant turning points in history are often shaped as much by private conversations as by public events. Long before armies march or governments change, decisions are frequently made behind closed doors, hidden within carefully worded letters and confidential meetings. Few moments illustrate this more clearly than the secret negotiations that preceded the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The corridors of St. James's Palace were often quiet after sunset. Candlelight reflected from polished wooden walls as servants carried sealed correspondence through dimly lit passageways. Across the North Sea, similar scenes unfolded within the Dutch Republic, where diplomatic envoys, military advisors, and trusted messengers traveled discreetly between residences. Every letter crossed dangerous political ground, for a single intercepted message could alter the future of an entire kingdom. By the late 17th century, England stood at a moment of growing uncertainty. King James II, a Catholic monarch ruling a predominantly Protestant nation, faced increasing opposition from influential political and religious leaders. His efforts to promote greater religious tolerance through royal authority, combined with fears surrounding the birth of his infant son, convinced many that England's political and religious balance might be changing permanently. The official history of the Glorious Revolution is well documented. In 1688, William of Orange accepted an invitation from several prominent English nobles to intervene. He landed in England with a substantial military force, while James II gradually lost political and military support before fleeing the country. Parliament later declared that James had effectively abandoned the throne, allowing William III and Mary II to rule jointly. Yet, beneath this familiar narrative lies a quieter mystery. How extensive were the negotiations before William's fleet ever sailed? One of the most important surviving documents is the famous Invitation to William, signed by 7 influential English figures who later became known as the Immortal Seven. Written in carefully measured language, the letter assured William that substantial support awaited him if he chose to intervene. The document survives today, offering direct evidence that organized communication occurred before the invasion. Many historians, however, believe this letter represented only a small portion of a much larger network of confidential discussions. Diplomatic correspondence from the period suggests that unofficial contacts had been developing for months, perhaps even years. Merchants, ambassadors, military officers, and political advisors traveled regularly between England and the Dutch Republic, providing opportunities for discreet exchanges beyond the reach of formal government channels. Because many of these conversations left no written record, reconstructing their full extent remains exceptionally difficult. Another question concerns the remarkable speed with which support shifted once William landed. Several senior military commanders, influential nobles, and government officials changed allegiance with surprising rapidity. Some historians argue that these defections reflected practical responses to changing political circumstances. Others wonder whether private understandings had already been reached long before William's arrival, allowing key figures to coordinate their actions at precisely the right moment. The evidence remains incomplete. Surviving letters reveal fragments of negotiation, but leave long periods undocumented. Some correspondence appears deliberately cautious, avoiding explicit language that might prove dangerous if intercepted. Other documents were destroyed, lost, or never written at all, leaving historians to infer connections from scattered references preserved in unrelated records. More speculative theories extend beyond England and the Dutch Republic. Some researchers have proposed that influential European financiers, foreign diplomats, or commercial interests quietly encouraged political change to reshape the balance of power on the continent. Others suggest that intelligence networks operating across Europe exchanged information that has largely disappeared from surviving archives. While direct evidence supporting these broader claims remains limited, they continue to attract attention because international politics of the period were deeply interconnected. There is also the enduring question of William himself. Did he merely respond to an unexpected invitation from concerned English leaders, or had preparations for intervention already begun before the famous letter arrived? Military planning, naval organization, and diplomatic coordination required considerable time. The surviving records demonstrate careful preparation, yet precisely when those preparations began remains uncertain. Today, the Glorious Revolution is often remembered as a relatively peaceful transfer of power, especially when compared with earlier conflicts that had shaken the kingdom. But behind that familiar description lies a web of private meetings, confidential messages, and decisions made far from public view. The surviving documents illuminate only part of the story. Somewhere between official correspondence and conversations that vanished into silence, the full extent of the negotiations remains hidden, inviting us to wonder how many of history's greatest transformations begin long before anyone realizes that change is already underway. As the secret negotiations before the Glorious Revolution remind us, history often conceals its greatest stories beneath layers of silence. Sometimes those secrets are hidden inside forgotten letters. At other times, they lie beneath the sea itself, resting in darkness where shifting currents and drifting sand guard them for centuries. Few maritime mysteries have inspired more fascination than the fate of the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Atocha. Far below the turquoise waters of the Florida Keys, sunlight fades into a quiet blue world where coral slowly grows across broken timbers and ancient anchors rest undisturbed on the seabed. Schools of fish weave through scattered cannon, while fine layers of sand rise and settle with every passing current. It is a landscape that changes constantly, concealing the past almost as quickly as it reveals it. The Nuestra Señora de Atocha was one of the most important ships in Spain's annual treasure fleet. In 1622, after loading immense quantities of silver, gold, copper, gemstones, tobacco, and other valuable cargo from across the Spanish Empire, the fleet departed for Europe. The voyage promised enormous wealth, but the sea had other plans. Only days after leaving Havana, the fleet encountered a powerful hurricane. The storm scattered the ships across the Florida Straits. Several vessels sank almost immediately, including the Atocha. Hundreds of sailors, soldiers, and passengers lost their lives as the heavily laden galleon disappeared beneath the waves. Contemporary Spanish records describe desperate attempts to recover the treasure, yet repeated salvage expeditions achieved only limited success. The exact location of the wreck gradually slipped from memory as storms reshaped the coastline year after year. For more than 3 centuries, the ship remained one of the world's most sought-after lost treasures. Then, in 1985, after years of painstaking exploration, treasure hunter Mel Fisher and his team located the principal wreck site. The discovery was extraordinary. Thousands of silver bars, gold artifacts, emeralds, coins, jewelry, navigational instruments, and personal belongings emerged from the seabed, offering an unprecedented glimpse into 17th century maritime trade. Historians and archaeologists alike recognize the importance of the find, not only for its immense value, but also for the remarkable preservation of its cargo. At first glance, the mystery appeared solved. Yet, many researchers believe the story did not end with that remarkable discovery. The hurricane that destroyed the fleet was exceptionally violent, capable of scattering wreckage over vast distances. While the main section of the Atocha has been extensively explored, archaeologists acknowledge that debris fields often extend far beyond the primary wreck site. Heavy currents, repeated storms, and centuries of sediment movement may have carried valuable artifacts into areas that remain unexplored even today. Spanish archival documents also leave room for continued investigation. Cargo manifests survive, but historians recognize that such records were not always complete. Merchants occasionally transported privately owned valuables that escaped official registration, while passengers sometimes carried personal fortunes unknown to customs officials. Could additional wealth have been aboard that never appeared in surviving inventories? More speculative theories go even further. Some treasure researchers suggest that portions of the cargo may have been recovered secretly during early Spanish salvage efforts, with little documentation preserved for future generations. Others believe isolated chests or sealed compartments separated from the main wreck during the hurricane, becoming buried beneath shifting sands miles away from the known site. While no definitive evidence confirms these possibilities, underwater discoveries and other historic shipwrecks have demonstrated that storms can disperse artifacts in unexpectedly complex patterns. There are even stories passed among generations of divers describing occasional discoveries of isolated coins or small artifacts far from the documented wreck field. Most can be explained by natural currents or earlier salvage activity, yet each new find encourages fresh searches across the surrounding seabed. Today, the Glorious Revolution is often remembered as a relatively peaceful transfer of power, especially when compared with earlier conflicts that had shaken the kingdom. But behind that familiar description lies a web of private meetings, confidential messages, and decisions made far from public view. The surviving documents illuminate only part of the story. Somewhere between official correspondence and conversations that vanished into silence, the full extent of the negotiations remains hidden, inviting us to wonder how many of history's greatest transformations begin long before anyone realizes that change is already underway. As the story of the Nuestra Señora de Atocha reminds us, some mysteries remain hidden beneath the sea, while others are concealed within the walls of royal palaces. In both cases, the surviving evidence is incomplete, leaving historians to reconstruct the past from scattered fragments. One such puzzle surrounds the brief life and unexpected death of Tsar Feodor III of Russia. The corridors of the Kremlin were hushed beneath the glow of candlelight, their stone walls reflecting the muted footsteps of courtiers and guards. Heavy wooden doors separated private chambers from grand ceremonial halls, where decisions affecting a vast empire were made behind layers of secrecy. Outside, Moscow endured long winters and uncertain political tides. Inside, the health of a single ruler carried consequences that could reshape an entire dynasty. Feodor III, the eldest surviving son of Tsar Alexis I, ascended the Russian throne in 1676. Unlike many rulers remembered primarily for military campaigns, Feodor devoted much of his short reign to administrative reform. He encouraged changes within the government, supported educational initiatives, and abolished the old system of местничество, a centuries-old hierarchy that determined political appointments based on noble ancestry rather than ability. Though his reign lasted only 6 years, many historians believe his reforms laid important foundations for later changes introduced during the rule of Peter the Great. Yet, throughout his life, Feodor struggled with poor health. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically frail from childhood. Chronic illness, limited mobility, and recurring pain appear frequently in surviving descriptions written by foreign diplomats and members of the Russian court. Modern historians have proposed several possible medical explanations, including inherited disorders, severe arthritis, spinal disease, or complications arising from scurvy or other nutritional deficiencies. No single diagnosis has achieved universal agreement, largely because the historical evidence remains incomplete. On May 7, 1682, Feodor III died unexpectedly at only 20 years of age. Official accounts attributed his death to natural illness. Given his documented history of poor health, many scholars consider this explanation entirely plausible. 17th-century medicine offered few effective treatments, and even relatively common illnesses could quickly become fatal. Even so, questions soon emerged. Feodor left no surviving heir, and his death immediately triggered a bitter succession crisis. Rival branches of the Romanov family advanced competing claims to the throne, while powerful noble factions maneuvered to secure influence over the future government. Within weeks, political unrest erupted into the Moscow Uprising of 1682, dramatically altering the balance of power inside the Russian court. Could such dramatic consequences have encouraged darker suspicions? Some later writers suggested that poison may have played a role in the young Tsar's sudden death. According to these theories, individuals who stood to benefit from a change in succession might have viewed Feodor's fragile health as an opportunity to conceal deliberate action behind what appeared to be natural decline. Because symptoms of many poisons available during the 17th century resembled those of ordinary illness, proving such a claim centuries later is virtually impossible. However, no contemporary investigation produced convincing evidence of murder. Surviving correspondence from foreign ambassadors and Russian officials generally emphasizes Fyodor's long-standing medical problems rather than signs of foul play. Most professional historians therefore regard natural causes as the more likely explanation. His declining health had been widely observed for years, making his early death tragic but not entirely unexpected. Still, the political climate surrounding the succession continues to invite discussion. The struggle that followed Fyodor's death ultimately resulted in the joint rule of Ivan V and the young Peter I, with their sister Sophia serving as regent during the early years. The rapid emergence of competing factions has led some researchers to ask whether preparations for succession had already begun before the Tsar's final illness reached its conclusion. Were influential courtiers merely responding to events as they unfolded, or had private negotiations quietly anticipated the possibility of his death? Many records from the period have been lost, while others survive only through later copies or foreign reports. Personal correspondence disappeared, court conversations were rarely recorded in detail, and official chronicles often reflected the priorities of those who commissioned them. These gaps make it difficult to determine where documented history ends and careful speculation begins. Today, the Kremlin remains a symbol of Russian history, its ancient walls overlooking centuries of triumph, conflict, and political transformation. Somewhere within those halls, a young ruler spent his final days while the future of an empire quietly shifted around him. Whether Tsar Feodor III succumbed solely to the illnesses that had shadowed him since childhood, or whether unseen ambitions played some hidden role in the closing chapter of his life, remains a mystery that continues to invite thoughtful reflection centuries later. As the mystery surrounding Tsar Feodor III reminds us, history is often shaped as much by missing documents as by surviving ones. A single lost letter or vanished ledger can leave centuries of unanswered questions. Few historical episodes illustrate this more clearly than the disappearance of many records connected to Scotland's ambitious Darien expedition, an undertaking whose failure changed the future of an entire nation. The reading rooms of old archives possess a silence unlike any other. Shelves lined with fading volumes stretch into the distance, while fragile manuscripts rest inside carefully protected boxes. Dust settles upon bindings that have survived wars, fires, and political upheaval. Yet sometimes the greatest mystery is not what these collections contain, but what they no longer hold. Empty spaces on forgotten shelves can be just as revealing as the documents that remain. At the end of the 17th century, Scotland launched one of the boldest colonial ventures in its history. The Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies sought to establish a settlement on the Isthmus of Panama, believing that control of this narrow stretch of land could transform global commerce. The proposed colony, named New Caledonia, would serve as a gateway between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, allowing goods to move across the continent rather than around South America. The vision attracted extraordinary public support. Thousands of Scottish investors committed significant portions of their savings to the enterprise. Merchants, nobles, craftsmen, and ordinary citizens alike viewed the expedition as an opportunity to secure Scotland's economic independence and international influence. Few could have imagined how dramatically those hopes would unravel. The first expedition departed in 1698 and reached the tropical coastline after a demanding Atlantic crossing. Almost immediately, the settlers encountered conditions they had not fully anticipated. Disease spread rapidly through the colony. Food supplies became scarce. The climate proved harsh, and relationships with neighboring indigenous communities varied over time. At the same time, Spain regarded the settlement as an intrusion upon territory it claimed, and prepared military action against the colony. Within a relatively short period, the settlement collapsed. A second Scottish expedition, unaware that the first colony had already been abandoned, arrived only to face the same overwhelming difficulties. By 1700, the Darien venture had effectively ended in disaster. Thousands of colonists had died from disease, malnutrition, or conflict, while the financial losses devastated Scotland's economy. Many historians regard the catastrophe as one of the major factors that encouraged the political negotiations leading to the Acts of Union in 1707. The broad outline of these events is well documented. Yet, historians have long been puzzled by the incomplete state of the surviving records. Company correspondence survives only in part. Financial ledgers contain unexplained gaps. Personal journals appear to end abruptly. Minutes from important meetings are missing, while some official reports seem unusually brief considering the scale of the undertaking. For researchers attempting to reconstruct the expedition in detail, these absences create persistent obstacles. The simplest explanation is also the most familiar. 17th-century archives were inherently fragile. Fires, moisture, insects, accidental disposal, and the ordinary passage of time destroyed countless documents long before modern preservation methods existed. During periods of political transition, records were often relocated, reorganized, or simply misplaced. From this perspective, the disappearance of many Darien papers reflects the unfortunate reality faced by historians studying almost any event from the era. Even so, alternative possibilities have attracted careful attention. Some scholars have wondered whether certain records were deliberately removed because they revealed uncomfortable details about the expedition's management. Investors lost enormous fortunes, and questions soon emerged regarding planning, leadership, logistical decisions, and financial oversight. If correspondence existed documenting serious disagreements or preventable mistakes, would influential individuals have preferred those documents to disappear? Direct evidence supporting deliberate destruction has never been discovered. Nevertheless, historians note that some missing materials concern precisely those decisions that remain most difficult to explain. Why were supply estimates so optimistic? How were reports from earlier voyages evaluated? What discussions occurred after disease and starvation became impossible to ignore? Surviving documents answer some of these questions while leaving others frustratingly unresolved. Another area of speculation concerns international politics. England's relationship with the Scottish venture was complicated. English authorities, concerned about diplomatic relations with Spain and the interests of the English East India Company, offered little meaningful support for the colony. Some later writers have suggested that sensitive diplomatic correspondence may have been intentionally withheld or quietly removed after the expedition failed, particularly if it revealed political calculations that later governments preferred to minimize. While surviving evidence does not confirm such claims, the incomplete archival record has encouraged continued discussion. There are also scattered references to private collections that may once have contained additional Darien papers. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, historians occasionally mentioned family archives, merchant correspondence, or estate libraries preserving letters written by expedition participants. Some of these collections were later dispersed through inheritance, auction, or neglect. Others simply disappeared from view. Whether they contained significant new information remains unknown. Modern archaeological work has added another dimension to the mystery. Excavations at the former settlement site have uncovered artifacts that sometimes challenge assumptions based solely on surviving written records. Everyday objects, building remains, and trade goods occasionally suggest activities that receive little attention in official documents. These discoveries remind researchers that the archaeological record can preserve details long after paper has vanished. Today, the tropical forests that surround the former colony have reclaimed much of the landscape where Scottish settlers once dreamed of building a prosperous trading empire. In libraries and archives across Scotland and beyond, historians continue searching through overlooked collections, hoping that a forgotten journal, an unopened bundle of letters, or an uncatalogued ledger might one day illuminate the expedition's final unanswered questions. Until then, the disappearance of so many Darien records remains a mystery in its own right, one that quietly reminds us how easily history can be altered, not only by what survives, but by everything that has been lost. As the missing records of the Darien expedition remind us, history is often shaped by what has disappeared as much as by what has survived. When letters vanish, archives fall silent, and official accounts leave unexplained gaps. The boundary between documented fact and enduring mystery becomes increasingly difficult to define. Few episodes illustrate this uncertainty more vividly than the political intrigues surrounding the Cossack hetman, Ivan Mazepa, and the rivals who challenged his authority. The broad grasslands of the Eastern European steppe, stretch toward the horizon beneath an immense sky. Rivers carve winding paths through forests and open plains, while wooden fortresses once stood guard over settlements exposed to shifting alliances and sudden conflict. At dusk, mist gathers above the water, softening the outlines of old watchtowers and forgotten roads. It is a landscape where messages once traveled on horseback across enormous distances, where loyalty could change with the fortunes of war, and where many of history's most important decisions were made far from royal courts. By the late 17th century, the Cossack hetmanate occupied a politically complex position between powerful neighboring states. The region balanced relationships with the Tsardom of Russia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Crimean Khanate, and the Ottoman Empire, while internal divisions among Cossack leaders added further uncertainty. Every diplomatic agreement carried consequences, and every alliance risked creating new enemies. Ivan Mazepa emerged as one of the most influential leaders of this turbulent period. Elected hetman in 1687, he proved to be an able administrator, an experienced diplomat, and a generous patron of education, churches, and architecture. His long period in power brought relative stability to the hetmanate, yet it also placed him at the center of competing political interests that extended far beyond Cossack territory. Official historical records describe a leader constantly navigating between rival powers while attempting to preserve a degree of autonomy for his people. However, those same records also reveal repeated conspiracies, accusations of betrayal, confidential correspondence, and shifting networks of supporters whose true intentions often remain uncertain. From the beginning of Mazepa's rule, opposition emerged within the Cossack elite. Several influential officers questioned his leadership, while others viewed his close relationship with Tsar Peter I as a source of growing concern. Some feared increasing Russian influence over Cossack affairs, while others believed cooperation with Moscow offered the best hope for long-term security. These disagreements rarely appeared openly at first. Instead, they unfolded through private meetings, personal alliances, and carefully worded letters that have survived only in fragments. One of the earliest known conspiracies involved senior Cossack figures who allegedly sought to remove Mazepa from power during the 1690s. Contemporary reports describe accusations exchanged between rival factions, yet many details remain frustratingly incomplete. Some correspondence disappeared. Official investigations recorded only selected testimony, and foreign observers often relied upon second-hand information. Were these genuine plots to overthrow the hetman, or political accusations designed to eliminate influential rivals? Historians continue to debate this question because the surviving evidence supports multiple interpretations. The political environment became even more uncertain during the Great Northern War, which began in 1700. As Sweden, under King Charles XII, challenged Russian influence across Northern Europe, every regional leader faced difficult decisions. Mazepa publicly remained loyal to Peter I for many years, contributing troops and resources to Russian military campaigns. Yet, behind the scenes, diplomatic communication appears to have become increasingly complicated. By 1708, Mazepa made the dramatic decision to ally himself with Charles XII of Sweden, hoping that Swedish success might preserve greater independence for the hetmanate. From the Russian perspective, this was an unmistakable act of treason. From Mazepa's supporters, however, the decision has often been interpreted as a desperate political calculation made under extraordinary circumstances. This turning point generated another enduring mystery. How long had secret negotiations actually been underway? Some surviving diplomatic correspondence indicates that indirect communication between Mazepa and Swedish representatives may have begun well before the formal alliance became public. Yet, the chronology remains incomplete. Many letters were destroyed during the conflict, while others survive only as references within unrelated documents. Historians know negotiations occurred, but the full sequence of events remains hidden behind missing records. Attention has also focused on Mazepa's domestic rivals. Certain Cossack leaders remained firmly loyal to Peter I, while others quietly delayed declaring their positions until events became clearer. Several individuals changed allegiance at different stages of the conflict, creating a political landscape in which personal survival often depended upon careful timing rather than ideological consistency. Could some rival factions have been conducting their own secret negotiations simultaneously? Modern historians consider this entirely possible. The surviving evidence demonstrates that multiple diplomatic channels operated throughout the region. Envoys traveled between military camps, noble estates, monasteries, and foreign courts, carrying confidential messages whose contents are now only partially known. In such an environment, overlapping conspiracies may have existed without leaving complete documentary evidence. One frequently discussed figure is Ivan Skoropadsky, who became hetman after Mazepa's break with Peter I. Contemporary records portray him as a capable administrator accepted by Russian authorities following Mazepa's downfall. Yet, some researchers have wondered whether conversations supporting his eventual leadership began long before his official appointment. Direct evidence remains limited, but the rapid political transition has encouraged continued examination of surviving correspondence. Another layer of mystery surrounds Vasil Kochubey, once among Mazepa's closest associates. In 1708, Kochubey and Ivan Iskra accused Mazepa of secretly negotiating with Sweden and attempting to betray the Russian Tsar. Their warnings reached Peter I, but the accusations were initially dismissed as false. Both men were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Only months later, Mazepa openly joined Charles XII. This dramatic reversal transformed the earlier accusations into one of history's most remarkable political ironies. Did Kochubey possess reliable intelligence that authorities refused to believe? Or had his accusations mixed genuine information with personal rivalry and political ambition? Historians continue to debate whether his motives reflected loyalty, revenge, or a combination of both. More speculative interpretations suggest that far more individuals participated in confidential diplomacy than official records acknowledge. According to these theories, influential nobles, orthodox clergy, merchants, and foreign agents may have maintained parallel networks of communication extending across Eastern Europe. Because successful secret diplomacy depends upon discretion, many of these contacts may never have appeared in surviving archives. Some researchers also point toward missing Cossack administrative records, arguing that wars, fires, and later political upheavals destroyed valuable correspondence capable of clarifying these relationships. Throughout the 18th century, numerous archives were relocated, reorganized, or lost entirely. What survives today represents only part of the original documentary landscape. There are even legends preserved within regional folklore, describing hidden meetings held inside remote monasteries, secluded manor houses, or isolated river crossings under the cover of darkness. According to these traditions, rival Cossack leaders negotiated alliances while publicly maintaining opposing positions. Although such stories cannot be verified through contemporary evidence, they reflect a broader historical reality. Secrecy was an ordinary part of political life in an age defined by shifting loyalties. The Battle of Poltava in 1709 ultimately reshaped the region's future. Sweden suffered a decisive defeat. Mazepa fled southward with Charles XII, and he died later that same year. His political vision collapsed, while Russian influence over the hetmanate expanded dramatically. Yet, the documentary trail surrounding the years leading to that moment remains incomplete. Today, the rivers, forests, and open plains once crossed by Cossack horsemen appear far quieter than they did 3 centuries ago. The fortresses have weathered, the camps have disappeared, and many of the letters that once carried secret instructions have long since vanished. Yet, within surviving archives, diplomatic fragments, and scattered eyewitness accounts, traces of hidden negotiations still emerge from time to time. Whether historians have already uncovered the full story of the conspiracies surrounding Ivan Mazepa and his rivals, or whether forgotten documents still rest unnoticed in distant collections, waiting to reveal another layer of this intricate political puzzle, remains a question that history has never completely answered. As the hidden conspiracies surrounding Ivan Mazepa reveal, political struggles often leave behind more than disputed loyalties. They also leave unanswered questions about vanished fortunes, secret journeys, and records that fade into silence. Across continents and cultures, moments of collapse have frequently been accompanied by rumors of missing wealth. Few stories capture that enduring fascination more completely than the mystery of the Ming loyalists' lost treasure fleets. The South China Sea appears calm in the early hours before sunrise. Gentle waves roll across waters that have carried merchants, fishermen, imperial envoys, and warships for thousands of years. Tiny islands emerge from drifting mist, while hidden reefs lie just beneath the surface, waiting for the tides to reveal or conceal them once more. Below those waters rest countless shipwrecks spanning centuries of maritime history, each preserving fragments of lives interrupted by storms, warfare, and uncertain destinies. For generations, sailors have spoken of ships that disappeared without leaving survivors or reliable records. Some were claimed by typhoons. Others simply sailed beyond the horizon and never returned. Among these enduring legends are stories of the treasure fleets said to have belonged to the last defenders of the Ming dynasty, vessels rumored to have carried imperial wealth into exile during one of the most turbulent periods in Chinese history. The Ming dynasty ruled China from 1368 until the mid-17th century, overseeing remarkable achievements in administration, culture, architecture, and international trade. Yet, by the 1640s, internal rebellions, economic hardship, and military pressure weakened the empire. In 1644, rebel forces entered Beijing, and the last Ming emperor in the capital took his own life. Soon afterward, the Manchu armies advanced southward, establishing the Qing dynasty and gradually extending their control across the country. The transition, however, was far from immediate. Across southern China, numerous princes, generals, scholars, and regional officials refused to recognize Qing authority. These groups, collectively remembered as the Southern Ming Loyalists, established rival courts and continued resisting for decades. Their struggle unfolded across provinces, rivers, coastal cities, and offshore islands, where naval power became increasingly important. Among the most influential leaders was Zheng Chenggong, better known in the West as Kochinga. A formidable military commander with extensive maritime resources, he controlled large fleets that operated along the southeastern coast. His forces resisted Qing expansion, maintained overseas trade, and eventually expelled the Dutch from Taiwan in 1662, transforming the island into an important Ming loyalist stronghold. The existence of these fleets is firmly established by historical records. They transported soldiers, merchants, supplies, diplomats, and valuable cargo between ports stretching from Fujian to Taiwan and throughout Southeast Asia. Contemporary accounts describe enormous quantities of silver, silk, porcelain, military equipment, and commercial goods moving aboard loyalist vessels. Such wealth was necessary not only to finance military campaigns, but also to sustain governments in exile. Yet, as the Qing gradually consolidated control, many of these ships vanished from history. Official documents mention fleets departing under difficult circumstances, but some never appear again in surviving records. Inventories become incomplete. Financial accounts stop unexpectedly. Reports written by foreign merchants occasionally describe heavily laden vessels sailing toward uncertain destinations before disappearing altogether. This has given rise to one of East Asia's most intriguing historical mysteries. What became of the Loyalists' remaining treasure? The conventional explanation is straightforward. Most historians believe the wealth was gradually consumed by the enormous cost of prolonged warfare. Maintaining fleets required constant expenditures on food, wages, repairs, weapons, and supplies. Years of conflict likely exhausted much of the treasure without leaving dramatic archaeological traces. Even so, certain details continue to encourage investigation. Several surviving inventories suggest that considerable reserves of silver and other valuables remained under Loyalist control during the final stages of resistance. If those records are accurate, not all of that wealth can be easily accounted for through known military expenditures. Some historians argue that incomplete bookkeeping and the destruction of wartime archives explain these discrepancies. Others believe the missing assets may have followed paths that have yet to be discovered. One possibility is that portions of the treasure were deliberately hidden. Historical precedents exist throughout Chinese history for burying valuables during periods of invasion or dynastic transition. Temporary caches protected wealth from capture, allowing governments or military commanders to recover it later if circumstances improved. If Ming loyalists expected eventually to reclaim lost territory, concealing treasure along remote coastlines or isolated islands would have been a practical strategy. Archaeologists have occasionally uncovered buried coin hoards dating to the late Ming period, though none have been conclusively linked to Loyalist fleets on the scale suggested by legend. Still, such discoveries demonstrate that emergency concealment did occur during this chaotic era. The sea itself offers another possibility. The waters separating mainland China from Taiwan and Southeast Asia are among the busiest shipping routes in the world, but they are also vulnerable to powerful seasonal storms. Typhoons have claimed countless vessels throughout history. Some researchers believe that treasure ships carrying substantial cargo may have sunk during these voyages, settling beneath layers of sediment where they remain undiscovered. Modern underwater archaeology has transformed understanding of historic shipwrecks, revealing remarkably preserved cargoes from vessels once thought permanently lost. Yet, only a small fraction of the South China Sea has been systematically surveyed. Vast areas remain unexplored due to depth, shifting seabeds, political complexities, and the sheer scale of the region. Could some of the Loyalists' missing ships still rest beneath those waters? It remains entirely possible. Another enduring mystery concerns overseas destinations. The Ming Loyalists maintained commercial and diplomatic relationships extending throughout East and Southeast Asia. Chinese merchant communities flourished in ports across present-day Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and beyond. Some historians have proposed that valuable cargo may have been transferred into private commercial networks, rather than remaining under direct military control. Wealth hidden within ordinary trade could have become almost impossible to distinguish from legitimate commerce. Supporting this idea are scattered references in European trading records describing unusually valuable cargoes arriving under uncertain ownership during the late 17th century. While none explicitly identify these shipments as Ming treasure, the coincidence has attracted continued scholarly attention. More speculative theories venture considerably further. Some legends claim entire treasure fleets deliberately sailed into remote archipelagos, where hidden anchorages protected both ships and cargo from Qing pursuit. According to these stories, carefully chosen crews swore lifelong secrecy before concealing imperial wealth inside sea caves, buried shoreline vaults, or isolated coves known only to a handful of trusted officers. Other traditions speak of coded maps divided among several commanders so that no individual possessed complete knowledge of the treasure's location. Similar stories appear in folklore across many cultures, often reflecting humanity's enduring fascination with hidden riches. While no documentary evidence confirms such elaborate arrangements, these legends persist because the historical record contains genuine gaps that invite imaginative interpretation. Attention has also focused upon the Zheng family's extensive maritime organization. Their commercial empire blended private trade, naval operations, diplomacy, and taxation across multiple ports. Some researchers wonder whether wealth officially described as lost may actually have been absorbed into merchant enterprises whose records later disappeared or were deliberately altered during the Qing consolidation of power. The Qing government itself may have contributed unintentionally to the mystery. Following victory over remaining loyalist forces, officials implemented policies designed to eliminate lingering resistance. Documents associated with rebel administrations were sometimes destroyed, confiscated, or dispersed. Families connected to loyalist leaders occasionally concealed correspondence to protect themselves from suspicion. As a result, historians today often work with incomplete archives representing only part of the original documentary landscape. European missionaries and merchants add another layer of complexity. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and English observers recorded valuable descriptions of maritime activity throughout the region. However, many relied upon translators, commercial rumors, or second-hand reports. Their writings occasionally mention mysterious convoys, heavily guarded cargoes, or unexplained disappearances without providing enough detail to verify exactly what they witnessed. Modern technology continues to reshape the investigation. High-resolution sonar, remotely operated underwater vehicles, satellite mapping, and as the mystery of the Ming loyalists' lost treasure fleets reminds us, history does not always hide its greatest secrets beneath the waves. Sometimes they disappear inside royal palaces, behind locked doors, or within forgotten inventories where a single missing page can erase the trail of priceless objects forever. Few stories illustrate this more vividly than the disappearance of the Amber Room's earliest treasures and the royal gifts that helped shape one of Europe's most celebrated masterpieces. Inside the grand halls of an 18th-century palace, amber glows with an almost supernatural warmth. Unlike gemstones carved from rock, amber was once living resin that slowly hardened over millions of years, preserving tiny fragments of prehistoric forests within its golden depths. Under the soft light of candles, polished amber reflects rich shades of honey, copper, and deep gold, giving every carved surface the appearance of being illuminated from within. Visitors often describe the effect as dreamlike, as though the walls themselves possessed an inner light. Long before the Amber Room achieved international fame, amber was already regarded as one of Northern Europe's greatest luxuries. Harvested primarily along the Baltic coastline, it traveled through royal courts for centuries, admired not only for its beauty, but also for the extraordinary craftsmanship required to shape such a delicate material. Skilled artisans spent years carving elaborate reliefs, religious icons, ornate furniture, jewel-encrusted cabinets, decorative boxes, mirror frames, and ceremonial gifts that demonstrated both wealth and political prestige. By the late 17th century, the finest amber workshops were operating in Prussia. Their craftsmen developed techniques unlike those used for wood, marble, or ivory. Every individual piece had to be carefully selected, heated, polished, and fitted together with remarkable precision. A single, decorative panel could require thousands of separate fragments assembled almost invisibly into a seamless composition. The Amber Room itself did not emerge suddenly as a completed chamber. Instead, historians believe it evolved from years of experimentation, during which master craftsmen produced smaller decorative works before assembling increasingly ambitious architectural designs. Early sketches, workshop records, and surviving inventory suggest that numerous amber panels, carved ornaments, gilded frames, mirrors, and furniture pieces existed independently before becoming part of the famous room. It is here that the first mystery begins. Many of these precursor works can no longer be identified with certainty. Some appear briefly within palace inventories before disappearing altogether. Others may have been dismantled and incorporated into later renovations without detailed documentation. A few objects survive in museums today, yet experts continue debating whether they truly belonged to the Amber Room's earliest artistic phase or were merely created by the same workshops during the same period. The surviving records provide only fragments of the story. Construction of the original chamber began around 1701 under the patronage of Frederick I of Prussia. Several distinguished artists contributed to the project over many years, including architect Andreas Schluter and amber craftsman Gottfried Wolfram, while later masters expanded and refined the design. Because the work progressed gradually, decorative elements were often created separately before being integrated into the growing composition. This meant that numerous valuable objects existed outside the room itself. Some served as prototypes. Others were diplomatic presentation pieces. Still others may have decorated entirely different royal apartments before eventually being relocated. Unfortunately, documentation from this formative period is incomplete. Court inventories of the early 18th century frequently describe luxurious amber furnishings using broad or inconsistent terminology. An object recorded simply as an amber cabinet or decorative amber panels might refer to pieces that no longer survive, or perhaps to works that still exist today under entirely different descriptions. As decades passed, the uncertainty only increased. In 1716, the future of the Amber Room changed dramatically. King Frederick William I presented the unfinished masterpiece to Tsar Peter the Great as part of a broader diplomatic effort to strengthen relations between Prussia and Russia. The decision transformed the chamber from a symbol of Prussian prestige into one of the Russian Empire's most treasured artistic possessions. Official correspondence confirms the extraordinary gift. Dozens of carefully packed crates carried amber panels, carved ornaments, mirrors, gilded moldings, and supporting structures across Europe before they eventually reached Russia. Later craftsmen enlarged the room significantly, adapting it to its new surroundings inside imperial palaces and adding additional decorative elements that blended seamlessly with the original work. Yet the Amber Room was never transported alone. Royal exchanges of the 18th century rarely involved a single masterpiece. Diplomatic gifts often arrived as elaborate collections intended to demonstrate generosity, wealth, and mutual respect between monarchs. Alongside famous works of art came ceremonial weapons, luxurious furniture, clocks, scientific instruments, porcelain, tapestries, manuscripts, paintings, silverware, carved stone objects, and smaller amber creations designed by the same celebrated workshops. Many of these accompanying gifts are well documented. Others appear only briefly before disappearing from history. Researchers examining royal inventories have discovered occasional references to amber mirror frames, carved caskets, devotional panels, decorative sculptures, jewel cabinets, and ceremonial furnishings that seem connected to the same artistic tradition as the Amber Room itself. Yet, after these early mentions, their historical trail often ends without explanation. Were they placed into storage? Transferred to different palaces? Presented as gifts to other members of Europe's royal families? Or did some quietly vanish long before anyone realized their historical significance? Each possibility finds some support within surviving records. Throughout the 18th century, European royal residences underwent frequent renovations. Decorative fashions evolved rapidly, prompting monarchs to redesign apartments according to changing artistic tastes. Furniture moved between residences, collections were reorganized, and older decorative schemes were dismantled to accommodate new architectural styles. Amber presented unique challenges. Although visually striking, it remained surprisingly delicate. Changes in humidity and temperature could cause panels to crack. Excessive dryness weakened adhesive compounds, while accidental impacts sometimes shattered carved sections beyond repair. Palace conservators regularly removed damaged components for restoration, occasionally replacing them with newly crafted pieces so skillfully executed that later generations struggled to distinguish original work from later additions. This raises another intriguing question. When inventories describe repairs to amber decorations, were every original fragment returned to its proper place? Or did some disappear during centuries of restoration, relocation, and reconstruction? The surviving documentation offers no complete answer. Instead, historians find scattered references to missing ornaments, replacement carvings, and workshop commissions whose precise purpose remains uncertain. Each document provides another small piece of the puzzle, yet none reveal the complete picture. By the 19th century, the Amber Room had become one of the Russian Empire's greatest cultural treasures. Visitors from across Europe marveled at its glowing walls and extraordinary craftsmanship. Travel journals praised its remarkable beauty, while artists attempted to capture its appearance in paintings and engravings. Yet even during this period of admiration, remarkably little attention was paid to the room's earliest companion pieces. Many of the royal gifts that once accompanied the chamber had already faded from public memory, surviving only as brief entries inside aging inventories whose significance would not become fully appreciated until generations later. As researchers began comparing those aging inventories with surviving palace records, another pattern slowly emerged. The more closely historians examined the documentation, the more they realized that the Amber Room had never existed in isolation. It formed part of a much broader collection of diplomatic treasures that reflected the artistic ambitions of European courts during the early 18th century. Some of those companion pieces could still be identified. Others had simply vanished, leaving behind only names, measurements, or brief descriptions preserved in fading ink. When the Amber Room was installed within the Russian imperial residences, it underwent several transformations. Craftsmen expanded the original Prussian design to fit larger spaces, adding new amber panels, gilded carvings, mosaic decorations, and elegant mirrors that enhanced its remarkable appearance. Every alteration required careful planning, and every modification generated new inventories, sketches, and workshop reports. Yet not every document survived. Fires damaged archives, administrative offices relocated. Palace renovations displaced records that were never fully reorganized. Some documents disappeared during wars, while others simply deteriorated through centuries of handling. Historians attempting to reconstruct the complete history of the room often discover that one valuable record ends precisely where another should begin. This incomplete trail has encouraged decades of investigation. Some scholars believe that several precursor panels were never incorporated into the finished chamber at all. Instead, they may have remained in storage as examples of earlier craftsmanship, or as spare decorative elements intended for future repairs. If such pieces existed, what eventually became of them? Were they quietly dispersed among other royal collections? Or could they still rest unnoticed in museum storage rooms, cataloged under entirely different descriptions? There are precedents for such discoveries. Throughout Europe, forgotten works of art have occasionally been rediscovered inside palace attics, monastery collections, private estates, or museum vaults where inaccurate cataloging concealed their true significance for generations. A carved panel regarded as an anonymous decorative object sometimes proves, after careful study, to possess a remarkable historical connection. Amber experts rely upon a combination of stylistic analysis, microscopic examination, and chemical testing to investigate these possibilities. Baltic amber possesses distinctive characteristics that can often distinguish it from similar materials. Tool marks left by 18th century craftsmen reveal particular workshop techniques, while pigments and adhesives provide valuable clues about an object's age. Even so, certainty remains elusive. The workshops responsible for producing royal amber masterpieces shared methods and artistic influences. Several master craftsmen trained apprentices who later established successful workshops of their own. Similar motifs appeared across multiple commissions, making it extraordinarily difficult to determine whether an isolated carving belonged to the Amber Room, another palace decoration, or an entirely separate royal project. The Second World War transformed these historical uncertainties into an even greater mystery. When German forces occupied the region surrounding Catherine Palace in 1941, Soviet museum staff attempted to protect countless cultural treasures. The Amber Room proved too fragile to remove safely, using the limited time and resources available. German specialists dismantled the chamber instead, carefully packing the panels before transporting them to Königsberg. The subsequent fate of the room has become one of history's most famous unsolved mysteries. However, the accompanying royal gifts receive far less attention. Many decorative objects associated with the palace collections were evacuated separately, hidden in storage, or relocated before advancing armies reached the area. Others remained inside the palace and suffered severe damage during the conflict. Detailed records documenting these emergency movements are incomplete, creating uncertainty about which objects survived and which disappeared forever. Some wartime inventories contain frustrating gaps. Crates appear without complete descriptions. Identification numbers occasionally change between successive reports. Certain shipments are recorded leaving one location but never documented arriving at another. Such inconsistencies are not unusual during periods of war, yet they leave historians with countless unanswered questions. Did every shipment reach its intended destination? Were some containers separated during transport? Could smaller amber objects have been stored independently from the famous chamber itself? These questions remain open because the surviving evidence offers no definitive resolution. Speculation naturally followed. One theory suggests that individual amber artworks were removed from official collections by retreating personnel hoping to preserve them from destruction. According to this interpretation, some pieces may have entered private hands under chaotic wartime circumstances before gradually disappearing through inheritance or discreet sales. Another possibility focuses upon the confusion surrounding the final months of Königsberg. The city endured devastating aerial bombardment, intense fighting, and widespread destruction. Buildings collapsed, museums burned, and countless archives disappeared. Within such conditions, it is entirely conceivable that smaller decorative objects became separated from larger collections, only to remain buried beneath rubble or dispersed without proper documentation. Over the decades, numerous reports have claimed that fragments of amber masterpieces surfaced unexpectedly in private collections. Some discoveries proved authentic examples of 18th century craftsmanship. As the mystery surrounding the Amber Room's vanished treasures demonstrates, history often leaves behind more than missing objects. Sometimes the greatest puzzle is not a lost masterpiece, but a message whose meaning has remained locked away for generations. Across centuries, countless codes have been broken by determined minds, yet a handful continue to resist every attempt at explanation. Among the most famous is the Beale cipher. But beyond the familiar story of hidden treasure lies another, less discussed mystery: whether the cipher's true origins reach much further into the past than the 19th century, perhaps drawing upon secrets inherited from the 17th century itself. Inside a quiet archive, an aging sheet of paper rests beneath protective glass. Its surface appears unremarkable at first glance. There are no elaborate illustrations, no royal seals, and no dramatic signatures. Instead, hundreds of carefully written numbers march across the page in neat columns, each separated by commas, as though following an invisible order known only to their creator. To an ordinary observer, they resemble nothing more than meaningless arithmetic. Yet, for nearly 2 centuries, these numbers have inspired treasure hunters, mathematicians, cryptographers, historians, and dreamers alike. The Beale ciphers occupy a unique place in American folklore. According to the traditional account published in the 19th century, a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale entrusted a locked iron box containing 3 encrypted documents to an innkeeper named Robert Morris in Virginia. The instructions allegedly promised that the papers described the location of an enormous buried treasure, the contents of the treasure itself, and the names of its rightful owners. The story is famous because only one of the 3 ciphers has ever been successfully decoded. Using the Declaration of Independence as a key, researchers deciphered the second document, revealing a detailed inventory of gold, silver, and jewels supposedly buried somewhere in Bedford County, Virginia. The remaining 2 messages, one describing the exact location of the treasure and the other identifying its owners, remain unsolved. Whether the treasure ever existed has been debated for generations. Many historians question the authenticity of the entire narrative, pointing to inconsistencies within the published pamphlet that first introduced the story in 1885. No independent contemporary records confirm Thomas Jefferson Beale's remarkable expedition exactly as described, and the original encrypted papers themselves have never been examined in a fully documented chain of custody before their publication. Yet, amid these familiar debates lies another intriguing possibility. What if the ciphers themselves were not entirely new creations? What if portions of their design, symbolism, or inspiration reached back far beyond the 19th century? This question has attracted a small but persistent group of researchers who believe the Beale mystery may have inherited ideas from much older cryptographic traditions. To understand why, it helps to step backward into the 17th century. Europe, during that period, experienced dramatic political upheaval, religious conflict, expanding maritime trade, and increasingly sophisticated diplomacy. Messages often traveled through dangerous territory where interception could alter the outcome of wars or negotiations. As a result, rulers, merchants, military commanders, and secret societies invested considerable effort into developing secure methods of communication. Codes became increasingly elaborate. Simple substitution alphabets gradually evolved into more complex numerical systems. Entire books served as encryption keys. Words could be transformed into sequences of numbers whose meaning remained hidden unless both sender and recipient possessed identical reference texts. Known today as book ciphers, these methods became surprisingly widespread. Governments employed them. Military officers relied upon them. Commercial networks occasionally adapted similar techniques to protect financial information. Religious minorities facing persecution also found coded correspondence invaluable. The resemblance between these historical methods and the Beale cipher has long attracted attention. The decoded Beale message relies upon a book cipher using the Declaration of Independence. Each number corresponds to the first letter of a particular word within the document. Without knowing the correct reference text, the numerical message appears almost impossible to interpret. Book ciphers themselves were certainly not invented in 19th century America. Examples existed centuries earlier. This has encouraged some historians to ask whether Beale, or whoever created the ciphers, borrowed from cryptographic traditions already well established in Europe during the 17th century. There are reasons to consider the possibility. English colonists arriving in North America brought with them administrative practices, military experience, commercial habits, and intellectual traditions inherited from Europe. Cryptographic knowledge did not remain confined to royal courts. Merchants, naval officers, explorers, and diplomats occasionally employed coded correspondence whenever sensitive information required protection. Could such techniques have survived across generations before eventually inspiring the Beale documents? It is impossible to say with certainty. Documentary evidence remains limited. Nevertheless, parallels between earlier numerical ciphers and the Beale system continue to invite careful comparison. Some researchers point toward the political turmoil surrounding the English Civil War. During the mid-17th century, coded messages circulated extensively among royalists, parliamentarians, foreign ambassadors, and intelligence networks. Numerous surviving archives preserve examples of sophisticated encryption systems remarkably advanced for their time. Although none resemble the Beale cipher exactly, they demonstrate that numerical cryptography had become an established practice long before the 19th century. Others examine maritime history. The 17th century witnessed intense competition among European powers seeking control of trade routes, colonies, and valuable cargoes. Sea captains routinely transported precious metals, jewels, commercial contracts, and confidential instructions across dangerous waters. Pirates, privateers, and rival governments all posed constant threats. Would merchants or naval officers have developed secret methods for recording hidden caches of wealth? Historical precedent suggests they might. Numerous documented treasure recoveries have involved coded maps, symbolic directions, or deliberately misleading instructions intended to protect valuable cargo from unauthorized discovery. However, direct evidence connecting these practices to the Beale story has never emerged. Another fascinating avenue involves secret societies. The 17th century saw the spread of organizations that valued symbolic knowledge, ritual communication, and intellectual secrecy. Although popular imagination often exaggerates their influence, some groups undoubtedly exchanged coded writings among trusted members. Over time, speculative authors have suggested that fragments of these traditions somehow survived into later centuries, eventually influencing the creators of the Beale ciphers. There is currently no historical proof supporting such a direct connection. Yet, the persistence of these ideas illustrates how easily genuine cryptographic history blends with legend. Some linguistic researchers focus instead upon the language surrounding the Beale narrative. Certain expressions appearing in the published pamphlet seem stylistically inconsistent with the period during which Thomas Jefferson Beale supposedly lived. Critics argue that the text reflects 19th century literary conventions, rather than authentic frontier correspondence. If true, this would weaken claims of an older origin. However, others counter that the pamphlet itself may have been edited or rewritten before publication, leaving open the possibility that earlier documents inspired the final version. The absence of original manuscripts complicates every attempt at definitive analysis. Even the mysterious iron box described in the traditional account contributes to the uncertainty. According to the published narrative, Beale delivered the locked container to Robert Morris around 1822, promising to return within 10 years. When he failed to reappear, Morris allegedly preserved the box unopened for decades before finally examining its contents. But no independently verified record confirms this sequence of events. The box itself has never been conclusively identified. Without physical evidence, historians must rely almost entirely upon a single anonymous publication issued more than 60 years after the supposed events. Such gaps naturally encourage alternative interpretations. One possibility is that the entire story originated as an elaborate literary creation designed to entertain readers fascinated by hidden treasure. Another proposes that the treasure existed, while many surrounding details became embellished through repeated retellings. A third suggests that authentic coded documents may have been combined with fictional narrative elements to create a more compelling publication. Each explanation accounts for some evidence while leaving other questions unanswered. Modern cryptographers continue testing the remaining undeciphered ciphers using increasingly sophisticated methods. Computer algorithms capable of analyzing enormous quantities of encrypted text have searched for patterns invisible to earlier generations. Artificial intelligence has expanded these efforts further, comparing the Beale numbers against thousands of historical books and statistical language models. Despite these advances, no universally accepted solution has emerged. This persistent resistance has fueled additional speculation. Some researchers wonder whether the remaining messages were never intended to be solved using the same key as the decoded cipher. Others suggest that multiple reference texts may have been required, or that transcription errors introduced during publication permanently corrupted the numerical sequences. If even a handful of numbers were copied incorrectly, successful decryption might become effectively impossible. Such possibilities remind us how fragile historical evidence can be. A single misplaced digit, a missing page, an overlooked editorial revision. Any one of these could transform an otherwise solvable cipher into an enduring mystery. The broader historical context also deserves consideration. 17th century Europe witnessed remarkable advances in mathematics, navigation, astronomy, and information exchange. Intellectual communities increasingly appreciated systematic methods for organizing knowledge. Cryptography evolved alongside these developments, benefiting from expanding literacy and more sophisticated administrative systems. Although direct connections remain unproven, the Beale cipher undeniably belongs to this wider history of human attempts to conceal information from unauthorized eyes. Whether its creator consciously borrowed from earlier traditions or independently rediscovered similar methods remains uncertain. Local folklore has further enriched the mystery. Across Virginia, stories continue to circulate about strangers searching remote hillsides with old maps, metal detectors, and copied cipher sheets. Some claim to have inherited family traditions describing buried chests hidden generations before the American Revolution. Others insist forgotten colonial records once referred to concealed valuables whose locations were deliberately encoded. Most such stories cannot be verified, yet they reveal how deeply the Beale legend has entered regional memory, blurring the boundaries between documented history and enduring folklore. Perhaps that is why the cipher continues to fascinate people long after many other treasure stories have faded. It asks questions that extend beyond the promise of gold. Who created the messages? Why were they written this way? Were they protecting wealth, preserving knowledge, testing future readers, or concealing something entirely different? And if fragments of their inspiration truly originated within the cryptographic traditions of the 17th century, how many forgotten ideas may have quietly survived across generations before appearing again in one of history's most enduring unsolved codes? Those questions remain as carefully sealed as the numbered pages themselves, inviting every new generation to look beyond the familiar legend and consider whether the greatest secret of the Beale cipher is not the treasure it supposedly hides, but the forgotten history that may have shaped its creation. The possibility of a forgotten historical foundation has inspired researchers to look well beyond Virginia, tracing the evolution of cryptographic methods across Europe and the early American colonies. Rather than asking only whether the Beale treasure existed, some historians have begun asking a different question. If the cipher truly reflects older traditions, where did those traditions originate, and how might they have survived long enough to influence a mystery published centuries later? One avenue of investigation begins in the archives of 17th-century governments. During this period, intelligence networks expanded rapidly as kingdoms competed for territory, trade, and influence. Secretaries carefully encrypted diplomatic dispatches before sending them across borders, knowing that intercepted messages could alter military campaigns or expose delicate negotiations. Many of these surviving documents reveal a remarkable level of sophistication. Instead of relying upon simple substitutions, some employed extensive numerical tables, code books, and multiple layers of encryption designed to frustrate unauthorized readers. A single number might represent an entire word, a city, or the name of an important official. Frequently used phrases received their own numerical symbols, making the resulting messages appear almost meaningless without the proper key. The resemblance to later numerical ciphers is difficult to ignore. Although no surviving 17th-century code matches the Beale cipher directly, the underlying principle was already well established. This observation has led some cryptographic historians to suggest that the Beale documents belong to a much longer tradition of practical encryption, rather than representing an entirely original invention. Colonial America provided another possible link. European settlers brought with them not only language and customs, but also administrative practices developed over generations. Military officers trained in Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands often retained the communication methods they had learned overseas. Merchants conducting business across the Atlantic occasionally protected financial information through coded correspondence, particularly when valuable cargoes were involved. The farther historians examine these commercial networks, the more complex the picture becomes. Shipping manifests occasionally contain unusual abbreviations whose meanings remain uncertain. Merchant diaries sometimes refer to private books or special numbering systems without explaining their purpose. Most scholars believe these references concern ordinary accounting practices, yet a few remain ambiguous enough to encourage continued investigation. Treasure stories naturally followed maritime trade. Whenever ships carried gold, silver, gemstones, or rare commodities across dangerous waters, rumors of concealed wealth inevitably emerged. Some legends describe captains burying cargo before storms, while others tell of merchants hiding valuables during periods of political instability. In many cases, later archaeological discoveries have confirmed that at least portions of these stories contained elements of truth. This historical background helps explain why the Beale narrative feels believable despite its many uncertainties. Hidden treasure was not an impossible idea. Secret records protecting its location were equally plausible. The real question is whether the specific story attached to the Beale cipher reflects actual history or later imagination. Researchers have also examined the numerical structure of the undeciphered messages themselves. The first and third ciphers differ statistically from the second, which was successfully decoded using the Declaration of Independence. Certain numbers appear more frequently than expected, while others occur only once or twice. Some specialists interpret these patterns as evidence that different encryption systems may have been employed. Others remain cautious. Statistical irregularities can arise naturally within relatively short encrypted texts. Without knowing the intended key, distinguishing meaningful structure from coincidence becomes extraordinarily difficult. The mystery deepens further when considering the publication history. The anonymous author of the 1885 pamphlet claimed to possess information inherited from earlier generations, yet provided few details that modern historians can independently verify. The decision to publish anonymously has fueled decades of speculation. Was anonymity intended to protect genuine descendants connected to the treasure? Or was it simply a literary device designed to make the story more intriguing? Both possibilities remain conceivable. Some literary scholars argue that the pamphlet reflects 19th century fascination with frontier adventure, coded messages, and lost fortunes. During that era, serialized mysteries and sensational travel narratives enjoyed enormous popularity. A carefully crafted treasure legend would have attracted immediate attention. Yet, even if portions of the narrative were fictional, that does not necessarily mean every element originated with the author. Writers frequently adapted older traditions, local folklore, and genuine historical anecdotes into new stories. It is entirely possible that the published Beale account incorporated fragments of much older legends whose original context has long since disappeared. This possibility has encouraged historians to examine oral traditions passed down in parts of Virginia and neighboring regions. Several 19th century collections of local folklore mention stories of hidden colonial wealth, mysterious travelers, and coded instructions left behind by unknown visitors. None correspond precisely to the Beale narrative, but they demonstrate that such themes circulated long before the pamphlet achieved widespread attention. Separating coincidence from genuine connection remains challenging. Oral traditions evolve over time. Details merge, disappear, and reappear as each generation retells familiar stories. Determining which elements are ancient and which developed more recently is rarely straightforward. As the unanswered questions surrounding the Beale cipher remind us, some of history's greatest mysteries survive not because of what was found, but because of what was left unsaid. A coded message can conceal a fortune, but silence can conceal an entire life. Few figures illustrate this more powerfully than Christopher Marlowe, whose sudden death has inspired centuries of debate. Yet, beyond the mystery of Marlowe himself lies another quieter puzzle: the fate of the men and women who knew him, and the curious deaths and disappearances of several associates whose stories faded into the shadows alongside his own. On a narrow London street, where weathered stone buildings still cast long afternoon shadows, an old parish church stands quietly behind iron gates. Its worn gravestones bear names almost erased by centuries of rain and wind. Some inscriptions remain perfectly clear, while others have dissolved into little more than faint impressions upon the stone. It is a place where history survives in fragments. Every missing name, every broken monument, every incomplete record invites the same unsettling thought. How many stories disappeared long before anyone thought to preserve them? Christopher Marlowe lived during one of England's most remarkable periods of intellectual and political change. Born in 1564, the same year traditionally associated with William Shakespeare's birth, Marlowe rose rapidly from modest beginnings to become one of the most celebrated playwrights of the Elizabethan era. His dramatic works transformed English theater through bold language, ambitious themes, and unforgettable characters whose influence can still be felt today. Yet, literature formed only one part of his remarkable life. Official records suggest that Marlowe moved comfortably among scholars, noble patrons, government officials, and individuals connected to England's expanding intelligence network. During the late 16th century, such circles frequently overlapped. Universities educated future diplomats and clergymen. Court patrons sponsored writers while maintaining political connections. Government agents relied upon educated men capable of traveling discreetly, gathering information, and communicating sensitive intelligence. Several surviving documents hint that Marlowe himself may have participated in such activities. One famous letter written by the Privy Council refers to his having rendered good service to the Crown on matters not intended for public discussion. The exact meaning of this statement has never been fully explained. Some historians interpret it as evidence of occasional government work. Others believe it reflects nothing more than routine administrative language. The ambiguity has fueled generations of speculation. Then came the events of May 1593. At only 29 years old, Marlowe died after a meeting at a house in Deptford. According to the official coroner's report, an argument erupted over the payment of a bill, traditionally referred to as the reckoning. During the confrontation, Marlowe allegedly seized a dagger before Ingram Freezer wrestled with him, inflicting a fatal wound above the right eye. The inquest concluded that Freezer had acted in self-defense. For centuries, this remained the accepted explanation. Yet, modern historians have observed several unusual features surrounding the incident. The three men present with Marlowe that day, Ingram Freezer, Nicholas Scaris, and Robert Poley, were hardly ordinary companions. Each possessed documented connections to powerful political figures. Each had participated in activities extending beyond everyday commercial affairs, and each occupied social circles where intelligence gathering, financial negotiations, and confidential assignments occasionally intersected. Their backgrounds have transformed an apparently simple tavern dispute into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Robert Poley perhaps attracts the greatest attention. He served as a trusted government courier and intelligence operative, carrying sensitive correspondence between influential officials. Surviving records place him at the center of several significant political events before and after Marlowe's death. Curiously, official documents indicate that Poley had been entrusted with urgent royal business shortly before the fatal meeting, raising questions about why he spent an entire day in Deptford rather than immediately delivering important messages. Historians have proposed numerous explanations. Perhaps his official task allowed enough flexibility for private meetings. Perhaps the timing was entirely coincidental. Or perhaps the surviving records preserve only part of a much larger story. No definitive answer has emerged. As the unanswered questions surrounding the Beale cipher remind us, some of history's greatest mysteries survive not because of what was found, but because of what was left unsaid. A coded message can conceal a fortune, but silence can conceal an entire life. Few figures illustrate this more powerfully than Christopher Marlowe, whose sudden death has inspired centuries of debate. Yet, beyond the mystery of Marlowe himself lies another, quieter puzzle: the fate of the men and women who knew him, and the curious deaths and disappearances of several associates whose stories faded into the shadows alongside his own. On a narrow London street, where weathered stone buildings still cast long afternoon shadows, an old parish church stands quietly behind iron gates. Its worn gravestones bear names almost erased by centuries of rain and wind. Some inscriptions remain perfectly clear, while others have dissolved into little more than faint impressions upon the stone. It is a place where history survives in fragments. Every missing name, every broken monument, every incomplete record invites the same unsettling thought. How many stories disappeared long before anyone thought to preserve them? Christopher Marlowe lived during one of England's most remarkable periods of intellectual and political change. Born in 1564, the same year traditionally associated with William Shakespeare's birth, Marlowe rose rapidly from modest beginnings to become one of the most celebrated playwrights of the Elizabethan era. His dramatic works transformed English theater through bold language, ambitious themes, and unforgettable characters whose influence can still be felt today. Yet, literature formed only one part of his remarkable life. Official records suggest that Marlowe moved comfortably among scholars, noble patrons, government officials, and individuals connected to England's expanding intelligence network. During the late 16th century, such circles frequently overlapped. Universities educated future diplomats and clergymen. Court patrons sponsored writers while maintaining political connections. government agents relied upon educated men capable of traveling discreetly, gathering information, and communicating sensitive intelligence. Several surviving documents hint that Marlowe himself may have participated in such activities. One famous letter written by the Privy Council refers to his having rendered good service to the Crown on matters not intended for public discussion. The exact meaning of this statement has never been fully explained. Some historians interpret it as evidence of occasional government work. Others believe it reflects nothing more than routine administrative language. The ambiguity has fueled generations of speculation. Then came the events of May 1593. At only 29 years old, Marlowe died after a meeting at a house in Deptford. According to the official coroner's report, an argument erupted over the payment of a bill, traditionally referred to as the reckoning. During the confrontation, Marlowe allegedly seized a dagger before Ingram Freezer wrestled with him, inflicting a fatal wound above the right eye. The inquest concluded that Freezer had acted in self-defense. For centuries, this remained the accepted explanation. Yet, modern historians have observed several unusual features surrounding the incident. The three men present with Marlowe that day, Ingram Freezer, Nicholas Scaris, and Robert Poley, were hardly ordinary companions. Each possessed documented connections to powerful political figures. Each had participated in activities extending beyond everyday commercial affairs. And each occupied social circles where intelligence gathering, financial negotiations, and confidential assignments occasionally intersected. Their backgrounds have transformed an apparently simple tavern dispute into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Robert Poley perhaps attracts the greatest attention. He served as a trusted government courier and intelligence operative, carrying sensitive correspondence between influential officials. Surviving records place him at the center of several significant political events before and after Marlowe's death. Curiously, official documents indicate that Poley had been entrusted with urgent royal business shortly before the fatal meeting, raising questions about why he spent an entire day in Deptford rather than immediately delivering important messages. Historians have proposed numerous explanations. Perhaps his official task allowed enough flexibility for private meetings. Perhaps the timing was entirely coincidental. Or perhaps the surviving records preserve only part of a much larger story. No definitive answer has emerged. Nicholas Scaris presents another intriguing figure. His documented career includes financial dealings, legal disputes, and associations with individuals involved in intelligence operations. Contemporary sources occasionally portray him as a confidence man, skilled at navigating London's complicated social world. Whether these descriptions accurately reflect his character or merely hostile reputation remains difficult to determine. Ingram Freezer likewise occupied an unusual position. Although remembered primarily as the man who killed Marlowe, Freezer worked for Thomas Walsingham, a member of the influential Walsingham family closely connected to England's intelligence establishment. Following the incident, Freezer received a royal pardon with remarkable speed, a perfectly lawful outcome if the inquest's verdict was accepted, yet one that has nevertheless encouraged later speculation. These three men shared more than a single afternoon together. Their overlapping connections suggest familiarity with networks extending into politics, commerce, and government administration. Consequently, some researchers have wondered whether Marlowe's final meeting served a purpose far more significant than settling an ordinary dining bill. The mystery deepens when considering what happened afterward. The surviving associates gradually disappeared from public attention. Some lived for years after Marlowe's death. Others left behind only scattered documentary traces. Their later lives remain surprisingly obscure despite the extraordinary historical interest generated by the Deptford incident. Robert Poley continued performing government service for several years. Official records document his participation in diplomatic and intelligence activities, yet details become increasingly sparse during the final period of his life. Historians know considerably less about his death than about many lesser-known Elizabethan officials. Did he simply fade into ordinary retirement? Or were important records concerning his career never preserved? The available evidence cannot answer with certainty. Nicholas Scaris also vanishes gradually from surviving documentation. Legal records reveal occasional transactions, but comprehensive accounts of his later years are lacking. Like countless individuals of the Elizabethan era, he eventually slips beyond the reach of continuous historical observation. This absence has encouraged imaginative theories. Some writers suggest that the men involved in Marlowe's death deliberately withdrew from public life after completing secret assignments. Others argue that such disappearances are entirely typical for ordinary Elizabethan citizens whose personal records were rarely preserved in detail. Indeed, the survival of historical documentation from the 16th century is often inconsistent. Many parish registers have been lost through fire, war, neglect, or simple deterioration. Personal correspondence disappeared with family estates. Government archives suffered accidental destruction. Countless everyday lives survive only through isolated references scattered among unrelated documents. The gaps surrounding Marlowe's associates therefore may reflect ordinary archival loss rather than deliberate concealment. Even so, certain coincidences continue attracting attention. Several individuals connected to Marlowe through literary, political, or intelligence circles experienced unexpectedly complicated careers marked by accusations, investigations, financial troubles, or sudden disappearances from surviving records. None of these developments necessarily indicate conspiracy. Elizabethan England was an uncertain world where shifting political loyalties often carried serious personal consequences. Nevertheless, the pattern remains intriguing. Some scholars have explored whether Marlowe's associates possessed knowledge that became increasingly sensitive following his death. The late Elizabethan government operated extensive intelligence networks designed to monitor foreign threats, religious conflict, and domestic conspiracies. Confidential information was compartmentalized carefully. Individuals aware of particular operations seldom possessed complete knowledge of broader activities. If Marlowe participated in even limited government service, as some documents appear to suggest, his associates may likewise have occupied positions requiring discretion. Unfortunately, surviving evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Private letters seldom discuss intelligence matters openly. Official memoranda employ vague language. Many administrative papers have disappeared altogether. The result is a historical landscape filled with isolated fragments that resist easy interpretation. One especially persistent theory proposes that Marlowe never died at Deptford at all, but instead escaped England under official protection, while another individual was buried in his place. According to this hypothesis, his surviving associates assisted in staging the event before quietly resuming their ordinary lives. Most professional historians remain skeptical. The surviving coroner's report is unusually detailed for its period, and no contemporary evidence conclusively supports the escape theory. Yet, its continued popularity illustrates how the mysterious backgrounds of Marlowe's companions have encouraged speculation extending far beyond the documented facts. Perhaps the greatest mystery lies not in any single unexplained death, but in the remarkable silence that followed. Men who briefly stood at the center of one of English history's most debated events gradually receded into obscurity, leaving behind only scattered signatures, legal records, official appointments, and unanswered questions. That silence has become almost as significant as the surviving records themselves. Historians are often reminded that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of deliberate concealment. Even so, when several individuals connected to an extraordinary event leave behind only fragmentary traces, curiosity naturally follows. The Elizabethan world was one in which reputation could change almost overnight. A trusted servant of the crown might spend years carrying confidential messages only to disappear from official correspondence once his duties ended. Merchants, legal agents, informants, and diplomats frequently traveled without attracting public attention, and many never entered history beyond a handful of surviving documents. This reality complicates every attempt to reconstruct the final years of Marlowe's associates. Take Robert Poley once again. Historians know he continued serving influential figures after 1593, and scattered records indicate that he remained involved in government business. Yet, after those references, his trail gradually fades. There is no dramatic account of his death, no detailed memoir, and no collection of personal letters revealing his thoughts about the remarkable events in Deptford. Did he deliberately avoid leaving written reflections, or were such papers simply lost over time? Neither possibility can be excluded. The same uncertainty surrounds Ingram Fraser. Following the fatal encounter, he returned to the service of Thomas Walsingham after receiving his royal pardon. Surviving estate records suggest that he continued managing aspects of his employer's affairs, living a life that appears surprisingly ordinary, considering the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Marlowe's death. To some researchers, this normality seems almost suspicious. If Fraser had participated in a carefully planned operation, would he not have received protection and resumed his previous responsibilities? Others reject that interpretation entirely. If the official verdict accurately described an unfortunate act of self-defense, then Fraser's continued employment becomes entirely understandable. A trusted servant cleared through legal process would have had little reason to abandon his position. Both interpretations fit portions of the historical record. Neither explains every unanswered question. Nicholas Scaris remains equally elusive. His earlier career demonstrates familiarity with London's complicated commercial world, where financial disputes, private agreements, and legal conflicts frequently overlapped. Contemporary descriptions sometimes portray him as resourceful, persuasive, and willing to operate in morally ambiguous environments. Such characterizations have encouraged later writers to cast him as a mysterious figure operating behind the scenes of political intrigue. Yet, caution is essential. Many surviving descriptions originate from hostile legal disputes, where damaging an opponent's reputation often formed part of the strategy. Without additional evidence, separating genuine character from courtroom rhetoric becomes extremely difficult. Another fascinating aspect concerns Thomas Walsingham himself. Although not present at the meeting in Deptford, Walsingham maintained close relationships with several of the men involved. He also served as an important literary patron, supporting writers and intellectuals during a period when artistic creativity often depended upon aristocratic sponsorship. His household represented a meeting point for scholars, poets, administrators, and politically connected individuals.